donors. If you say the mainstream media is dependent upon advertisers.
What is either, I mean, your kind of where you come down to as you go to sleep each night thinking about this stuff, or as you get up in the morning thinking, where do you, in your gut, in your heart, where do you think where is our path to actually solving some of this, which, given the crises we've talked about, is serious business for us, for our children, and for the rest of the planet?
Yep. I think that we are in a place where each individual in our republic has to start with resisting their own temptation to rage from fear.
Here we go for today's number. It's February 7, 2022. 10 balls. Each ball has a number. Numbers 1 through 10. Swirl the numbers. Pick a number. Today's number is 9.
Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. French President Emmanuel Macron is meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow today in hopes of de-escalating tensions over Ukraine. Macron will meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev Tuesday. This comes as the Biden administration continues to warn of a possible imminent attack on Ukraine by Russian forces. And as U.S. officials reportedly said over the weekend, Russia now has 70% of the necessary combat forces in place to invade. Following the comments from Washington, Ukraine's foreign minister told Ukrainian citizens do not believe the apocalyptic predictions. The U.S. has also ramped up its arms transfer to Ukraine and sent troops to NATO allies in Eastern Europe and Germany in recent days. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is meeting with President Biden at the White House today before heading to Kiev and Moscow. On Sunday, Scholz said he was open to deploying more German troops to Lithuania to help prop up NATO's military presence in Eastern Europe. The U.S. topped 900,000 recorded deaths from COVID-19 Friday. President Biden marked the grim milestone by urging all Americans to get vaccinated and boosted. Case numbers are steadily falling from this winter's Omicron-fueled highs, though experts say related deaths, which now average over 2,500 per day, have yet to peak. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy is lifting his state's mask mandate in schools. This follows a similar decision in Pennsylvania last month. The governors of New York and Connecticut said last week they're reconsidering school mask mandates as well. In international coronavirus news, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said he's experiencing mild symptoms after testing positive for COVID-19. Separately, recently sworn-in Honduran President Xiomara Castro also tested positive with mild symptoms and announced she's working in isolation. In Canada, the mayor of Ottawa has declared a state of emergency, saying the city is under siege from thousands of truck drivers who've been blocking roads to protest COVID restrictions and vaccine mandates. The protests, which have now spread outside Ottawa, have also expanded to include broader grievances against the Canadian government of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Organizers of the so-called Freedom Convoy have been linked to far-right and neo-Nazi movements, with some participants waving Confederate flags or swastikas. Some participants waving Confederate flags or swastikas. In Minneapolis, protesters have been taken to the streets following the police shooting of 22-year-old Amir Locke last week. The Minneapolis Police Department released a video of the raid Thursday in which a SWAT team stormed into an apartment where they found and shot Locke, who is asleep, who is not a suspect in their warrant. On Friday, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey announced a moratorium on no-knock warrants. Amir Locke's parents described him as a talented musician and beloved community member while speaking at a news conference Friday. His mother, Karen Locke, called for accountability in her son's killing.
At the end of the day, I believe that he was executed by the MPD, and I want the police officer that murdered my son to be prosecuted and fired.
In Mexico, some 380 migrants, including families with young children, were evicted from a makeshift border camp in the city of Tijuana Sunday morning. Dozens of Mexican National Guard, Army soldiers, and municipal police raided the camp where the migrants, mostly from Central America, had been forced to live for nearly a year due to the Biden administration's ongoing enforcement of policies that have blocked people from entering the U.S. to apply for asylum. This is a migrant from El Salvador.
We are caught off guard. We don't know where we will be taken. A shelter? I don't know. I don't know what the Mexican authorities are going to do with us. We don't know what they're going to do.
Iran has welcomed a move by the United States to waive sanctions against foreign countries and companies that work in Iran's civil nuclear sector. The sanctions were imposed by the Trump administration in 2020 after it pulled the U.S. out of the landmark 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Iran's called ending those sanctions a necessary first step toward restoring the nuclear agreement. Last week, Iran's foreign minister in Tehran said that Tehran is willing to engage in direct talks with the Biden administration if negotiations on a new nuclear deal reach an advanced stage. In Madagascar, at least 10 people have been killed, some 48,000 displaced from their homes after Cyclone Batsirai battered the island overnight Sunday. The cyclone made landfall in the southeastern city of Mananzarai with winds of about 100 miles per hour, triggering massive floods, uprooting trees and destroying buildings. This is the second major storm to hit Madagascar in 2 weeks. Nigeria's environmental ministry has declared a major disaster after a ship carrying more than 50,000 barrels of crude oil exploded off Nigeria's coast. The blast killed at least one crew member, with 7 others still missing. Survey crews reported a sheen and emulsified oil around the vessel as authorities warned the spill poses a great danger to coastal communities. Ecuador's constitutional court has ruled that indigenous communities should have much more control over whether to allow extractive projects on their lands. In a decision handed down Friday, judges ruled indigenous groups can halt proposed mining and oil drilling projects if they're found to require, quote, excessive sacrifices to the collective rights of communities and nature, unquote. It's a blow to President Guillermo Lasso, who has promised to double Ecuador's oil production, and a major victory for the Ajicolfan community and other indigenous groups who've suffered the effects of environmental destruction for decades. In Puerto Rico, torrential rains inundated San Juan and other regions of the island Saturday, breaking a rainfall record that had previously been set in 1998. Meanwhile, thousands of teachers from across Puerto Rico led a massive protest Friday demanding higher wages and pension protections. The action was in response to the approval last month of another plan to restructure some of Puerto Rico's massive debt. The plan includes a slight increase of teachers' base salaries, significantly lower than what was demanded. It also freezes future pensions for current teachers. Many teachers say they're forced to take on other jobs to make ends meet. The Republican National Committee censured Congress members Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger Friday over their involvement in the House investigation into the Capitol insurrection, which the censure referred to as legitimate political discourse. The 2 Congress members are the only Republicans on the House committee. In related news, former Vice President Mike Pence Friday rebuked Trump's false claim that Pence had the authority to change the results of the 2020 election.
President Trump said I had the right to overturn the election. But President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election.
North Carolina Supreme Court struck down Republican gerrymandered redistricting maps and ordered the legislature to redraw the Congressional and General Assembly maps ahead of primaries in May. Meanwhile, in Arizona, the Republican House Speaker thwarted an attempt by a fellow Republican lawmaker to move forward a bill that would grant Arizona's legislature the authority to reject election results, among other measures. In other voting news, Pamela Moses, a black activist from Tennessee, was sentenced to 6 years in prison last week for trying to register to vote, not knowing she was ineligible due to a felony conviction. Officials erroneously told Moses her voting rights had been restored. Her lawyer is appealing the case. Moses is the founder of Black Lives Matter Memphis and a former mayoral candidate. And former employees of Washington, D.C.'s NFL team have detailed new sexual harassment claims against team owner Daniel Snyder. Team marketing manager and former cheerleader Tiffany Johnston testified last Thursday to the House Committee on Governmental Reform.
Mr. Snyder touched you in a sexual manner that night, correct?
Correct.
Snyder did so on purpose, right?
Correct.
How do you know that?
He left his hand on the middle of my thigh until I physically removed it.
You did not consent to being touched in that way, right?
Absolutely not.
In July, the NFL issued a $10 million fine to the Washington football team after 15 women came forward with allegations of sexual harassment and verbal abuse. In 2020, the team dropped its name and mascot, a racist slur against Native Americans, which it first adopted in 1933. Last week, the team announced its new name, the Washington Commanders, which the team called a tribute to Washington's military ties. The name was dropped as a result of years of organizing in indigenous communities. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
Something you really would do with your friends while you're sitting around having dinner. And I suppose somebody in the party thinks that this interview or another dinner with Thomas Bach is somehow going to calm this whole thing down, but it just inflames it and has once again driven the Peng Shuai issue to the forefront of people's minds.
That's our China correspondent Stephen McDonald reporting there. That's it for OS. Remember, we'd love to hear from you. +44 773 075 1925. I'm Nancy Kachangira. Thank you for your company.
This is the BBC World Service, where our series, Women Building Peace, continues.
We're hearing from women trying to make a difference in conflict zones. In episode 2, we look at post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina.
I think the political activism of women did change the landscape of Bosnia.
But tensions in the country are rising again.
The situation is dangerous for Europe as a whole.
Women Building Peace at bbcworldservice.com. This is the BBC World Service, and on our website you can explore more of our programmes, from documentaries to science. Listen and download at any time by going to bbcworldservice.com. On air, online and on smartphone, this is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
ABC News with Chelsea Hetherington. A bill to protect religious freedoms will be the top priority for the federal government when Parliament resumes sitting today for the first time this year. With only limited parliamentary days left before an election has to be called, the coalition is trying to deliver on its promise to pass the proposed protections. But there are divisions within the Liberal Party about whether the bill goes too far and could protect people making discriminatory statements on other grounds. Liberal Senator Eric Abetz says it's important an agreement is reached so the government can honour its commitment.
The bottom line is that religious freedom does need to be protected, and in relation to schooling, ultimately it should be up to mums and dads to determine the basic ethos of the school.
Western Australia has announced new quarantine rules expected to kick in today, while the nation prepares to reopen its international borders. Eamon Baghdadi reports.
New definitions for close contacts of COVID cases in WA will roll out on Tuesday, along with relaxed isolation protocols, slashing the quarantine period from 14 to 7 days. Under the new rules, anyone who tests positive for COVID-19 must self-isolate for a minimum of 7 days. The new rules come as Omicron continues to spread across WA. Meanwhile, almost 2 years after the government closed Australia to the world, the international border is set to reopen on February 21 to those who are fully vaccinated. The news has been welcomed by tourism bodies who have been struggling most during the pandemic.
The first shipment of the Novavax COVID vaccine has arrived in Sydney, with about 3 million doses on board the flight from Singapore. They'll be supplied to GPs, pharmacies and state hubs across the country and will be available from February 21. However, the Health Minister Greg Hunt says they first have to undergo batch testing by the Therapeutic Goods Administration. Australia has purchased 51 million doses of Novavax, which is the fourth COVID vaccine available in Australia. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has revealed that an Australian-Chinese dual citizen is currently being prosecuted under Hong Kong's sweeping national security law. Here's Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts.
The department said last year that an Australian had been detained under the law, but now it's given more details. The man was arrested in January last year when China intensified its crackdown on pro-democracy figures. The ABC's been told the man has been detained for lengthy periods since then. The department has not said what charges he's facing, but the national security law gives the authorities broad powers to impose heavy penalties, including life imprisonment. The department has also revealed that Australian officials have been repeatedly refused consular access to the man.
Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen says he made an unintentional mistake in taking credit for helping to free an Australian in Myanmar whom the military government says was not being released. Sean Turnell, an economist to deposed Myanmar leader Aung San Suu Kyi, was arrested last year a few days after a coup. He is charged with breaching the Official Secrets Act, which is punishable by up to 14 years in prison. Mr Sen has apologised for the confusion. British Defence Minister Ben Wallace says Britain will send a further 350 troops to Poland. Mr Wallace says the additional troops will send a signal the country and Poland are standing side by side. Britain last year sent 100 troops to Poland to help support it with a migrant crisis at its border with Belarus. Mr Wallace says NATO is a defensive alliance that poses no threat to Russia.
It is a self-defence mechanism amongst our allies of 30. That is what it's there for. Secondly, no one wants to divide and rule Russia. What we do have a problem with in the United Kingdom is the malign activity we see coming from the Russian state.
Around a quarter of the Australian Winter Olympic team will have departed Beijing today, as strict COVID regulations require an exit within 48 hours of finishing competition. Tracy Holmes reports.
Curlers Tali Gill and Dean Hewitt, along with luger Alex Filazzo, will arrive back in Australia today. The 8-strong moguls team, including gold medalist Jakara Anthony, will leave Beijing this afternoon. Meanwhile, alpine skier Katie Parker, delayed by a positive COVID test, is the last Australian athlete to fly into Beijing. Her arrival today leaves her little time to prepare for tomorrow's women's slalom. Tracy Holmes in Beijing for ABC Sport.
ABC News. Taking a look at the national weather for your capital cities on Tuesday. Brisbane, mostly sunny, tops of 30 degrees. Sydney, a few showers, tops of 25. Possible shower in Canberra, reaching 24 degrees. Melbourne, a sunny day, tops of 31. In Hobart, mostly cloudy, tops of 23 degrees. Adelaide, showers developing in the afternoon, reaching 34 degrees. Perth, mostly sunny, tops of 26. And in Darwin, showers, possible storm, tops of 31 degrees. And that's the weather forecast for your capital cities on Tuesday. You're listening to the latest ABC News with Chelsea Hetherington.
Good morning. Good morning. It's February 7th.
Welcome.
2022, and it's a Monday. Here in LA, another clear morning, very still right now, 48 degrees Fahrenheit, around 9 Celsius. Today I was thinking about the song Comfortably Numb by Pink Floyd. from the year 1980. This afternoon it's going to be going up to a beautiful 79 degrees Fahrenheit, around 26 Celsius, and we are going to be enjoying once again those beautiful blue skies and golden sunshine all along the way. Everyone, have a great day.
Well, haggard travel agents clustered hopefully around their TVs at 2:30 today as the Prime Minister stepped into his courtyard. And a cheer would have gone up when he declared that tourists would again be let in on February the 21st, a year and 11 months after the drawbridge was pulled up and they were all stranded inside. Investors cheered as well and bought shares in the listed travel agents as fast as they hope the tourists will buy tickets. Hello World, Flight Centre, Webjet, Corporate Travel, Regional Express and Qantas were all up a lot. The market as a whole fell slightly, with ANZ Bank hit hard after a poor result, and Magellan was down 10% after founder and chairman Hamish Douglass decided to take leave of absence to prioritise his health. On the plus side, GrainCorp jumped more than 12% on the back of a very good trading update. Global markets mostly went up on Friday and today, apart from Tokyo, and so did commodities, especially energy commodities, oil, LNG and thermal coal, because of the rising tensions around Ukraine. And the Australian dollar stayed just under 71 US cents. The number of job advertisements fell in January, but not much. Despite the big rise in the number of cases with Omicron, job ads remain 10% above the Delta variant lows. And I've been keeping you up to date with the big boom in the price of Australian carbon credit units, or ACCUs. Well, it's fallen for the first time by $1.50, having gone up $40 in 12 months. And that's finance.
I wonder, are they not aware of what China is doing? If human rights exist in the world, then the Olympics should not be held in China.
Beach weather is still months away, but businesses along the New Jersey coast are already looking to fill summer jobs, including more than 400 at this Boardwalk Fun Zone.
If we don't have the employees, unfortunately, like we had to do last year, we had to shorten our hours. So a lot of the guests that wanted to come, we couldn't stay open the whole time that we usually do. So a lot of guests were disappointed in that. So we're hoping we can go back to our regular operating hours. We just need to have those employees to fill those long days.
Nearby restaurants are also looking for more help.
Normally we'd wait till April or May to start hiring for the summer. We're starting now.
At the Robinson Ale House, they've raised their starting salaries to $15 an hour, well above the state's minimum wage. Places that rely on tourism, like here on the Jersey Shore, really have struggled. But labor shortages are a factor nationwide across retail and service industries. Many businesses that have been dealing with supply chain issues, forcing them to raise prices, are also now having to raise wages. Big chains like Macy's department store have cut operating hours. Others are getting creative, offering bonuses, or in the case of this pizza delivery chain, cash incentives for customers who pick up their own orders. Some states have even deployed the National Guard in response to healthcare worker shortages. Experts blame fewer childcare options for working parents and generous government benefits during the pandemic for the problem.
I think those jobs have become a lot more unpleasant. We've also given people a lot of money. They're not still getting money, but they certainly got a lot of money over the last couple of years, so they have less need to work. And also they have more options.
Others say the pandemic led many people to rethink how work fits into their lives and to question whether jobs involving long hours and low pay are really worth it. Industry groups, including the National Retail Federation, are pushing the government to authorize more work visas for immigrants to make up for the shortages.
For every worker looking for a job, there is almost 2 jobs open that they can choose from. So that's really putting a strain on our members for sure.
With the pandemic and its special unemployment benefits beginning to fade away, they're hoping to bring back the workers and the fun before the summer tourism season really heats up. Kristen Salini.
Hi, Freya. So what sort of companies are we talking about here? What are the most common links to modern slavery?
Well, Rose, in our report that we launched this morning, we've looked at the statements of 102 companies that are sourcing from sectors with known risks of modern slavery. And in particular, we're looking at clothing brands that source garments from China, healthcare companies sourcing gloves from Malaysia, and companies that source seafood from Thailand and fresh produce from right here in Australia.
Okay, so companies that have had previous links to forced labour, they are legally obliged to report what they're doing. Is that the situation?
Yes, so for the first time over the course of the past year, large companies with an annual turnover of $100 million plus have been required under Australia's new modern slavery laws to publish statements about the risks of modern slavery in their supply chains and the steps that they're taking to address those risks. So the companies that we've looked at are all sourcing from regions with known modern slavery risks. But what we've found is that actually over half the companies that we looked at failed to identify and disclose some of the most obvious risks in their supply chain. So that was quite a shocking statistic for us.
Yeah. So which body oversees and polices companies' obligations to report forced labour risks? Who's holding them or meant to be holding them to account?
Well, I think many people would be surprised to learn that the Modern Slavery Act that we have in place doesn't currently have any sort of strong enforcement regime. There is no real penalty for failing to put in a statement to the government or for failing to completely disclose your risks or your actions required. And so the Act as it stands doesn't really have teeth despite the severity of the sorts of situations that we're talking about.
Did you find cases of modern slavery happening within Australia, Freya?
Yes, one of the sectors we looked at was fresh produce, the horticultural sector in Australia, which, there's been countless investigations and inquiries into the exploitation on farms, particularly against migrant workers and people on temporary visas, and some really horrible reports of exploitation and abuse. So I think for a lot of people, they either think modern slavery has happened in the past or if it might be happening overseas, but it's actually, it's happening here in Australia and vastly in our region. I think there's 25 million people who are estimated to be in conditions of forced labour, with 2/3 of them in our region, whether they're trapped in a Malaysian glove factory making gloves for the COVID crisis or whether they're on a boat in Thai fishing waters catching fish that land up on our supermarket shelves.
So if companies aren't reporting risks of forced labour, then presumably they're not taking much action to address those risks either.
Yeah, our research found that only less than 1/3 of the companies that we reviewed could disclose evidence of effective actions to mitigate those risks. And what we found was that while a number of companies were actually putting in statements and there was quite high levels of reporting overall, when you drill down into the detail of the statements, there was not very much there in terms of real concrete actions to try and change the way in which modern slavery is existing in those supply chains and to work with suppliers to remediate some of those issues.
Okay, so what needs to change and how do you make that change happen?
Well, Rose, this year the Modern Slavery Act will be reviewed because it's up for a 3-year review by government, and so we're asking the government to make this act enforceable for a start. If the government's serious about eliminating modern slavery in Australia's supply chains, it needs to reorient this act away from just reporting and require companies to take action. And in particular, we're looking at penalties for failure to comply, but more than that, a duty to prevent modern slavery in supply chains that would require companies to identify non-slavery risk and to take action to mitigate their key risks, as well as heightened guidance for business who are operating in these high-risk sectors.
Freya Dinshaw, thank you.
Thank you, Raz.
Welcome to the Empire Files. I'm Abby Martin. In case you're not familiar with this case, please check the links in the description below for more information. Long story short, back in 2020, I was barred from speaking at Georgia Southern University because Georgia is one of dozens of states across the country with anti-BDS, or boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, laws on the books. In order to speak there, I was asked to sign a loyalty oath to Israel, pledging to never support or advocate for the BDS movement. As a staunch advocate for Palestinian human rights, I refused to sign the contract. Instead, I filed a lawsuit to sue the state for violating my First Amendment rights, with the hope of getting the law overturned. And in May of 2021, on the heels of another vicious Israeli onslaught in Gaza, Georgia Federal District Court Judge Mark Cohen ruled in my favor. This was a huge victory and added to the precedent set by legal challenges against these unjust laws in other states. This, of course, outraged the Israeli government, which lashed out on social media and went to work trying to overturn our victory. These laws were on the books in the first place, not because of the desire of the American people, but because of the desire of the Israeli lobby. But once a judge deemed Georgia's law unconstitutional, Israeli officials openly worked with Georgia's politicians to request that the law be changed, not repealed. This is not even hidden. Check out how crazy this is. In the actual legislative session, an Israeli government official was present. The state legislature officials even admitted that this Israeli official was the one that asked them to change the law, and they complied in a shocking act of foreign subversion. I was completely taken aback by how openly Georgia's politicians were literally acting on behalf of a foreign power to restrict the constitutional rights of American citizens. So as promised, Israel and the Georgia legislature came back with an amended law to try to moot my case. On January 27th, they voted to amend the law I sued over so that only individuals and businesses with a contract for over $100,000 are required to sign the Israel loyalty oath. This anti-Palestinian, pro-apartheid amendment was passed overwhelmingly with 146 yes votes and only 9 no votes, showing how strong the hold of the Israeli lobby is on our government. Shameful, absolutely shameful. These politicians knew that a judge had already ruled that the law violates the very constitution they'd taken oath to protect, but they didn't care. That's how beholden these politicians are to money and power. They're frauds. But here's the thing. The law is still ruled unconstitutional. It is still unenforceable in the state of Georgia. No one will have to sign this pro-Israel pledge in order to work for the state for contracts under $100,000. But if any individual or business with over $100,000 in contracts refuses to sign it, it would still be deemed unconstitutional to try to punish them under this law. So, my legal precedent still holds. And the only thing this amendment accomplished was finding a way to keep the language on the books. Basically a propaganda victory, so Israel can erroneously claim they defeated my lawsuit. So what does this mean? Well, the pro-Israel crew is happy they can claim to have made my lawsuit irrelevant because they stopped the law from being repealed by simply modifying it. And they're completely counting on the fact that no business with big contracts will follow suit and continue to challenge the law. Of course, even though the law is still unconstitutional and thereby unenforceable, it is still criminal that it's on the books at all, and clearly will still have a chilling effect on those who may feel they have no choice but to choose between their free speech rights and the ability to work in Georgia. This is not about me. It's about all of us and the guiding principles that supposedly make our country great. For as much as the corporate media and political establishment cry about censorship and free speech, there's barely any discussion about these outrageous laws that exist in more than half the country. The crackdown on Palestine solidarity and pro-Palestine speech is one of the biggest threats to the First Amendment today. And these laws are part of Israel's strategy to criminalize peaceful activity and speech that undermines their legitimacy. When will this country wake up to this egregious assault on our civil liberties? When will Americans become outraged that a foreign government is actually removing our constitutional rights? Amnesty International has become the latest mainstream human rights organization to deem Israel an apartheid state, which was another heavy blow to the Israeli propaganda machine. So let's keep pushing the momentum forward to support the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. And that means making sure this law is completely struck from the books, not only in Georgia, but everywhere. I'm not giving up on overturning this law in Georgia, and I will be exploring the next legal steps to do so. Because no state or politician can hold back the tide of justice we know is coming for a free Palestine.
Stock of the day, something that's in the news today. GrainCorp out with their full year guidance, forecasting full year profits to come in between $235 to $80 million. Earnings projected to top 500 million as well, thanks to a strong Australian grain market. Exports expected to top 9 million metric tonnes as it continues to benefit from pretty good weather conditions. Shares firmly in the green this morning, up 14%. Of course, it's integrated storage, grain handling, processing, the whole integrated storage, handling, processing, the whole integrated. Gary, what do you think of the grain results and the stock price of grain silo?
Yeah, look, I think obviously it's a great result there. I think you got a bit of a tip there last week with New Farm, obviously having a strong result. Everyone sort of knew the grains was going to be pretty robust here. Obviously a great agricultural sort of last 12 months for Australia. I think the big plus in that update this morning was probably not so much the headline number or cracking result. It was actually that 2023 looks like it's going to be pretty strong as well. So if we look at some of the earnings that were out there, everyone was expecting a pretty good result in 22, but the numbers were definitely tapered off in sort of some of the forecasts for 23. So I think that the fact that they've come out and said 23 looks like it's going to track pretty strong as well. Early indications is 23 is going to be strong. That's probably the big sweetener there today, and that's so pretty positive there. So look, big jump. Hard to chase it after it's rallied 14%, but the fact that we've got a stronger outlook, a bit longer term here is pretty positive for the stock. So if I held the stock, I wouldn't be selling it. I'd be definitely holding on here. I think the stock goes higher. It's just sort of from a trading perspective here, how do you position here, with a reasonable amount of risk reward. So it's a hold for me, but I think it goes higher.
Okay, Pagey, what do you think of GrainCorp? You can't get better conditions for a company like this, can you? Because you always talk about cyclical businesses when you come on with businesses like this. Well, this is really peak cycle, isn't it?
And this is what happens when everything lines up. So not only have we had great growing conditions, the Northern Hemisphere has had a lot of demand for Aussie grain. They've had supply issues there. GrainCorp saying that they haven't had much in terms of supply chain disruptions. So everything has just lined up. And you're seeing this massive jump in profit, which is great news. And as Gary rightly pointed out, it's encouraging that they're expecting the next year to be pretty strong as well. It's a 100-year-old business. It's been around for a long time. And although the last 12 months in terms of the share price has been fantastic, as we panned out, as we did a moment ago, you'll see the longer-term performance isn't that great from a share price perspective, but also from a fundamentals perspective. The sales growth has been pretty anemic. Operating margins have been trending down quite sharply recently. And it's yes, a very big, well-established business, but also a very, very tough business. And it's one with, when we're in this game, we're trying to sort of forecast cash flows. And who knows what growing conditions are going to be like in 2024, 2025, et cetera, et cetera. Who knows if they can manage to turn margins around. I think a lot of that's kind of in the price, really. I mean, if just on the numbers that they released today, you're looking at a company on a forward PE of about 7 to 8 or so, which is very, very low. But I think the market's sort of accepting the fact that this is an extraordinarily lumpy business and a very, very difficult business. So it's great that we're experiencing good times at the moment. But generally speaking, I'm trying to look out sort of 5 years plus. What's a business like this earning then? And I think it's hard because of the cyclical nature of it. You sort of have to have an average look through the cycle. You have to be someone who's very prepared for a very lumpy kind of business performance. But for me, that means that, you have to be patient. The next 6 months, next 12 months is great, but value is in the long-term cash flows, and that's just very difficult. So for me, I go with Gary. I think it's probably a hold. But on the same basis, I think it's, and I know I always say this, I'm a broken record, but opportunity cost is something I think we have to really focus on in investors. So is this a terrible business? Absolutely not. Is this one of the best 20, 30 businesses on the ASX? And, you know, when your money's in GrainCorp, it's not in others that might be a little bit better. Right, so a hold if you like that kind of thing. But for me, you know, personally, I'm not a buyer, I'm not a holder. I think there's better opportunities.
Easing curbs in COVID-0 regions like China will cause some 2 million deaths in a year. That's according to Chinese researchers. The study came as China's zero COVID restrictions have come under growing scrutiny as it hosts the Winter Olympics in Beijing. China is the only major economy sticking with a zero COVID policy, despite warnings that it could hurt growth. Others like Singapore, Australia and New Zealand have abandoned the strategy in favor of what policymakers called learning to live with COVID. Researchers used studies from Chile and Britain to calculate the baseline efficacy of current vaccines. They estimated even with a global vaccination rate of 95%, if population mobility was restored to 2019 levels, all COVID-0 regions would see more than 234 million infections within a year, including 64 million symptomatic cases and 2 million deaths. The researchers added that the key to controlling the virus is developing vaccines that are better at preventing infections. Jaya Dantas, a professor of international health in Australia, said that throughout the world, everyone else has moved on and that the paper was, quote, very pessimistic. She added the study is, quote, an in-house document which might want to support the government's policy.
It's just because of science.
Hong Kong is following the mainland strategy. The global financial hub reported a record 614 new COVID cases on Monday, according to health authorities. The former British colony and global financial hub has become one of the most isolated cities in the world. The restrictions have caused shortages and rising costs in important foreign food. Residents crowded supermarkets and neighborhood food markets on Monday to stock up on food and necessities as transport is disrupted at the border with mainland China. Health experts said the city's current strategy of shutting itself off as the rest of the world shifts to living with coronavirus is not sustainable.
South Africa's police and intelligence services failed to anticipate, prevent and disrupt days of arson and looting last year in which more than 300 people died. That conclusion came from a report commissioned by President Cyril Ramaphosa and released on Monday. The violence had been triggered by the jailing of former President Jacob Zuma for contempt of court and was fanned by anger over persistent poverty and inequality nearly 3 decades after the end of apartheid.
Now from the indictment, am I correct?
Soldiers were deployed to restore calm as shops were ransacked and key infrastructure targeted. Around 50 billion rand or $32 billion of damage was caused by one estimate. The report analysed the government's preparedness and response. It described how a combination of inadequate training and poorly equipped stations resulted in police being overwhelmed. The experts also said the executive branch of government, comprising the President and his cabinet of ministers, carries some of the blame and must take responsibility for its lapse of leadership. The report's authors said they had been told several times that factional battles within the African National Congress had become a serious source of instability for the country. Ramaphosa and Zuma are from opposing factions in the ANC. The President is expected to say on Thursday what action the government will take in response to the report.
Australia is using tech to fight against deforestation and global warming. Decreasing carbon dioxide in atmosphere is key in the battle to tackle climate change. The main obstacle in that fight is how to plant new trees in a short time in areas that are hard to access. Biotech company Airseed in Australia is now experimenting with drones to help speed up the process. Engineers and biologists collaborated to create
This is one of those ones where I think it was a little bit unexpected.
Australia is using tech to fight against deforestation and global warming. Decreasing carbon dioxide in atmosphere is key in the battle to tackle climate change. The main obstacle in that fight is how to plant new trees in a short time in areas that are hard to access. Biotech company Airseed in Australia is now experimenting with drones to help speed up the process. Engineers and biologists collaborated to create a new drone organic pod. This drone then allows them to plant trees in a fraction of the time the process normally takes.
The advantage
Report says North Korea's missile program is being funded through stolen cryptocurrency. North Korean cyber attacks have stolen more than $50 million worth of cryptos in the past 2 years, according to investigators. Such attacks are an important revenue source for Pyongyang's nuclear and ballistic missile program, the report says. Let's get more on this from Clifford Coonan, my colleague here at DW Business. Clifford, how advanced is North Korea in areas like crypto crime, cybercrime?
Cybercrime, yeah, it certainly seems to be getting more sophisticated. It used to be when they needed to earn foreign currency, the North Koreans would make crystal meth or fake $100 bills. But clearly they're moving with the times and they see an opportunity here with cryptocurrency. And in recent years, we've seen a number of cyber attacks using malware and phishing and things like that. And clearly the sophistication level has increased now where they're able to access cryptocurrency and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of it.
Yeah, I mean, the UN says $50 million alone stolen in the last 2 years. How does the process work?
Well, basically, a lot of it goes through an organization called the Surveillance General, which is the Secret Service. And they've coordinating with a hacking group called Lazarus, which has been targeted by US security officials, and they say it's one of the most sophisticated of the cyber criminals. And then they go for hot wallets, which is where people store their cryptocurrency in wallets that are connected to the internet. And then using phishing, malware, and various other things, they seem to be able to access the money. So it's showing a great level of sophistication, and clearly this is something that's probably going to increase over the coming years.
A UN report saying North Korea's missile program is being funded through stolen cryptocurrency. DW's Clifford Coonan, thank you.
Rwanda in absentia. When he got wind, he appealed against that decision because he was never present. He was rejected that an appeal cannot be launched by somebody who is not present. Then Kenya filed an application to detain him for 21 days, pending extradition proceedings to be filed. We did object to that application on grounds, one, that there is no formal application of extradition that is in place. Two, the red alert the state is talking about has been in place for 12 years, yet our client has been traveling up and down every other time. Third, on the argument that there is no extradition agreement between Kenya and Rwanda, the court has agreed with us that if he is released, Kenya has an extradition agreement with America. It is Kenya that will make the application. So the court has entered him on a bond of 1 million shillings with a surety. The matter will be mentioned on the 28th of February. And the court found out that he's not a flight list. The state was acting prematurely by bringing the person to court. And therefore, we are satisfied that this gives confidence to everybody that everybody is equal before the law.
Ottawa has declared a state of emergency as protesters opposed to the COVID-19 measures continued to paralyse the Canadian capital. The city's mayor says demonstrators outnumbered police and the tents and vehicles have blocked roads. Thousands of truckers protested at the weekend, joining the hundreds who remained there since last week.
Right now, the upside risk in this market is exceptionally high. One of the reasons why, is alluded to, the markets are incredibly tight from a physical perspective. Whether you see it on the refining margins or in crude oil itself, the entire complex is extraordinarily tight, reflected in that super backwardation. Obviously, what it means is that this market is incredibly vulnerable to any type of supply or demand disruption, very much like what we saw in European gas and power, let's say late last year. So oil has now teed itself up, to look very similar to what European gas and power looks like. That was what we highlighted this risk back in October of last year. We're at that point right now. And so the question is, can you come up with any supply or reduction in demand as you move into the spring to be able to ease the situation? Now, 2008 was a financial crisis. This is a molecule crisis. we're out of everything. I don't care if it's oil, gas, coal, copper, alley, you name it, we're out of it. And it's, you know, the backwardation in this market is an indication of just how different this market structure is from 2008. 2008, the curve was going up by the back end, dragging it up. It was in contango at some points in time, which tells you it was paper financial buying on the back end as opposed to outright shortages. This curve is it's super backwardated, and many of these commodities are super backwardated, which is, you know, textbook shortages. In fact, you know, when Keynes created, you know, the idea of backwardation in the 1930s, you know, this was what he had in mind, and we have not seen such types of backwardation. I've been doing this 30 years, and I've never seen markets like this. This is textbook shortages.
This is one of those ones where I think it was a little bit unexpected. You know, obviously, as you say, a pandemic beneficiary, everyone was demanding, or their products were in high demand, particularly their latex gloves. And that was the big shock in this set of results, is that demand there really fell off quite dramatically at the same time as they suffered those supply chain issues and cost pressures as well. It's a huge decline though. It's a huge miss. The margin compression saw them reduce their earnings per share guidance by 20%, which as I say, that's seismic, and obviously the share price was savaged as well. The problem that I have with this one, again, is just a lack of clarity. When will that demand pick up? When will those pressures abate? But this one was not without some evidence either. You know, it was in a downtrend. You know, I love my technicals. In a downtrend for about 6 months prior to these results, and was just holding support around $30. And the bulls were trying to defend that, and then the results came out, and it's obviously smashed through that level and is down to 25. This is why, Scotty, I could never be a value guy. I could never be a value investor. I have to be a trend guy, but that's why this one makes my sell today. So I still think Ansell is a great company, but just too hard at the moment.
So-called intelligence, and then given it to the UK and asked them to make it public, which then raises a series of questions. God. First of all, if the U.S. came up with this notion of a Russian plot in Ukraine, why are they claiming it was Britain that discovered it? And why are they giving it to Britain to make public? And basically what it is it's a repeat of the Iraq War, where basically you're asking your client state to do the dirty work for you. Yeah. And it didn't take long for that to fall apart, but no one in the media seems to care about being lied about.
Man, it makes sense, doesn't it? Because as you say, it works for both parties. It makes the states look like there's backup. It's not just them saying this about Russia, it's other people. And it makes Boris look strong. It's exactly what he needs. The dead cat on the table to take away from his madness at the moment, the stuff going on there. Yes. Tell me, why can't Ukraine and Georgia, they're independent states, why can't they sign up, you know, to NATO if they want?
Well, in theory, you know, people should be able to join alliances, right? It sounds fine, but then you look at, would the U.S. allow Mexico to join a hostile military alliance, or Canada?
Right.
Especially if there were prior commitments not to expand those military alliances. It's a question of, what do we value more? Global peace or the right of people to join hostile military alliances? And why do we even have NATO? The Soviet Union is over. They lost. They collapsed. The NATO was established, you know, as a counter to the Soviet Union. And but that's done. I mean, the Soviet Union's been over for 30 years now. There is no, you know, Russia has some military alliances, but nowhere near the size of the Warsaw Pact. And so, yeah, sure, in theory, the people have the right to join alliances. But when you look at the fact that what this would mean is a hostile military alliance on the border of a nuclear armed power, like what is our higher priority? Preventing nuclear war or letting Ukraine join a useless military alliance? You know, it's a question of priorities.
That's interesting. It's really interesting, I think, because most people, and I count myself among them, who are maybe novices with this, who don't know so much about Russia and Ukraine, it's just always like Russia's the bad guy, manipulating everything and doing, and it's just a lot of what you're saying. And I've read your articles, brilliant article as well. It's really surprising to me and really fascinating to learn. And of course, they're all doing they're all as bad as each other. Is that the situation we're in? That they're all just like selfish states trying to do their own bidding?
Well, I think states by definition are selfish. it's hard to look at governments, any government, and find examples of altruism. Although, to me, the biggest examples of foreign policy altruism is Cuba, where Cuba, you look at what they do internally, and certainly there's repression of dissidents, but you look at what they've done around the world, helping to end apartheid in South Africa. But that's a rare case of, I think, humanitarian foreign policy. Otherwise, it is in self-interest. And so in that context, it's a question to me of who has the most power. And when you have the most power, you can do the most damage. And to me, it's not even a question. The global hegemon right now is the U.S. They have hundreds of military bases around the world. Russia has, a couple, at least, like you can count the Russian military bases around the world on one hand. And U.S. has unprecedented military corporate power. And Ukraine is at least on Russia's border, and Russia at least has deep historical ties to Ukraine. They used to be a part of the Soviet Union. Russia gave Crimea to the Soviet Union. There are people in Ukraine who speak Russian. There's deep ties, so you can see why at least Russia is involved there. Ukraine isn't on the U.S.'s border. Why is the U.S. even a player there? Why is the U.S. What gives them the right to claim that to be sort of a equal party to Russia when they don't even share a border? The U.S. is across the ocean. And to me, the fact that the U.S. role there, it's just taking for granted that the U.S. has the right to be sending in billions of dollars worth of weapons, choosing the prime minister of Ukraine, it just speaks to how much we've normalized U.S. hegemony. And, that's what I try to focus on with work I do, is just pointing out it doesn't have to be that way. And it's not good for anybody. It's not good for the citizens, I think, of Ukraine, of Russia, of the West, of the UK, of the US, where so much of our money and time is spent on stoking global conflicts, and weapons manufacturers are making a lot of money. But here in the US, people's basic needs are not provided for. Millions of people don't have health care. So why are we spending money to send weapons to Ukraine and fuel conflicts there instead of taking care of people's basic needs at home?
Well, why are they doing that? Selfishly, what does the US stand to gain?
The U.S. stands to gain just hegemony. It's an empire. And people in that world are incentivized to only think in those terms. They're not incentivized to think of what could bring the most prosperity and peace to people around the world, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, London, the U.S., anywhere. They think about what can benefit us, what can make us, because we identify with a mentality that seeks meaning from dominating other people, from choosing their governments, from
This is one of those ones where I think it was a little bit unexpected.
Conflict. That's what they derive meaning from. The line from Chris Hedges, "War is the force that gives us meaning." It's for a certain class in Washington and London. The line from Chris Hedges, "That's what gives the force that gives us meaning." They see joy in life from bullying people and feeling tough. That's what gives them meaning. As the global hegemon. They see joy in life from bullying people and feeling tough. Interests acting as the arms industry certainly makes a lot of money. So that's ultimately constant. And certainly you can look at certain interests. $2.7 billion worth of weapons makes a lot of money. Ukraine from 2014 conflict. And look, even if you put aside $2.7 billion worth of weapons hegemony, whether you since 2014 U.S. hegemony, and look, even if you put aside the question, whatever, put that aside, hegemony from a military point of view. No matter how many weapons the U.S. pours in, Russia can always win. That's the whole point. Is Russia is on Ukraine's borders, so they just by default have overwhelming military supremacy. So no matter how many weapons the U.S. pours in, it's actually not going to make a difference. It's not going to help Ukraine defeat a war with Russia if one breaks out. So what's the point? It's just to have a conflict for the sake of it, and to justify all these military expenditures in the U.S. because we have massive military spending on all these weapons that are completely useless. We don't know what to do with, while we're not giving people their basic needs. So that's the point of it all.
God, it's like they're bored, just looking for something fun to do. There must be some element of we can put off Russia if they were planning to invade Ukraine. Is this just, did the Cold War ever end? Is this an extension of the Cold War? Just everybody flexing their muscles?
The Cold War could have ended. Russia wanted to be a part of a new European security architecture. Again, the Soviet Union was destroyed. And Russia was not in an ability to be the domineering power that the Soviet Union was. And so they wanted to be a part of a new European security architecture. Putin, if you go back to his early years in power, he wanted to be a part of NATO. He talked about that. But the problem is bringing in Russia into the fold would have taken away an enemy. And to justify being a hegemon and spending all your money on weapons instead of giving your people health care, you need to have enemies. And there also, I think, was such animus towards Russia, just entrenched in Washington from the Cold War. If you look at the way all these intelligence heroes in the U.S. talk, like James Clapper, he's the former director of national intelligence, he'll talk about that he's a Cold Warrior, so he sees Russia through a certain lens. And he talks about how he'll say things like Russians are genetically predisposed to deceive. You know, they have these really bigoted views towards Russia, and we can't underestimate that factor in driving U.S. policy, just straight up bigotry and chauvinism.
In your world of sort of political journalism, are you sort of arguing with other journalists who are, and you're sort of at this moment in time a little bit more team Russia, and then others are more team US? Is there a lot of debate there, fiery debate?
There are people who certainly want to categorize me as team Russia, but that's, I think, something they can only do when they don't want to discuss the facts.
Sure.
Facts are facts, and I don't discuss things based on their partisan utility or their country utility. I've never been to Russia. My only really personal experience with Russia is that my family, my father's side of the family, fled Hungary to escape the Soviet occupation. So that's my personal experience with Russia. But yeah, in this era where Russia is the official bad guy, and then yes, anything that I do that challenges the hegemonic narratives around Russia gets deemed to be Team Russia. And look, in the U.S. for the last 5 years, we've had Russiagate, this idea that Russia has brainwashed millions of Americans via bots and hacked emails, and is conspiring with the former president Donald Trump, and is blackmailing him. And for pushing back on that, which I thought was just not only really dumb and factually flawed, but incredibly dangerous, and would encourage a kind of hawkishness that has led to exactly what we're going through right now with Ukraine, where basically diplomacy was criminalized, and the idea of making peace with Russia was deemed to be a traitorous act. I mean, that essentially was what Russiagate was largely about. For pushing back on that, I've been called, Putin apologist and all that stuff like that, when I don't really care about Russia internally. Russia internally has a lot of problems, by the way, which I think the U.S. has major responsibility for. After the Soviet Union fell, their economy was privatized with the heavy involvement of the U.S. The U.S. sent over all these neoliberal economists who basically helped design the oligarchical system that Russia has now, and I think was really responsible for a lot of the misery that Russia has been through. And yeah, sure, now Russia is kleptocratic, it's autocratic, it's all these things, but that's for Russians. That's Russians' business. I'm concerned with how the U.S., how the West is interfering with Russia and using Russia to interfere in countries all around the world, including in Ukraine.
This question might not really be answerable, but I'm just trying to understand politics at that higher level. Biden and Boris, are they sitting around sort of hatching an evil plan? Are they sitting there going like, haha, this will help us do, we can now we can put these people here, and then everyone will think there's a big war an invasion about to happen that isn't going to? Or are they convincing themselves like, well, it looks like Russia's going to invade?
I'm sure they do convince themselves that Russia is going to invade. I'm sure they do. I think you have to do that to rationalize what you're doing. It's like, look, we've all, and that's a human trait. I mean, we can all convince ourselves of anything if it serves our agenda. I mean, I'm not immune from that. So it's very human. But the problem is these are politicians whose decisions have really huge human consequences. And sometimes, look, you can find in the internal record, years after the fact, frank admissions of policy, of what was actually going on. My favorite example that I say a lot is, and it's very related right now to all the animus towards Russia, which is in Syria, where 10 years ago this month, Jake Sullivan, who's the current national security advisor, he wrote to Hillary Clinton an email about Syria. And at that point, the U.S. had started to take part in this dirty war where the CIA was funneling billions of dollars worth of weapons into sectarian death squads in Syria. They were called moderate rebels, but it turns out that these moderate rebels were dominated by sectarian death squads, including Al-Qaeda. And so Jake Sullivan writes to Hillary Clinton. He writes, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. That's a direct quote. Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Now, the U.S. wasn't saying that publicly. In public, they were saying we're supporting moderate rebels, right? We're supporting freedom-loving moderate rebels to bring democracy and freedom to Syria. But in private, they knew the truth, that they were arming sectarian death squads and siding with Al-Qaeda, the militia that attacked the U.S. on 9/11. So sometimes there is a frank admission of the facts, and I wouldn't be surprised if 10 or 20 or 30 or whatever, 100 years from now, when the declassified documents come out, we'll get more frank admissions like that the U.S. knew all along what they were doing in stoking a conflict in Ukraine instead of trying to bring peace.
Am I right in saying it's typically a sort of conservative or right-wing policy to want to sort of meddle with other countries and left-wing to sort of stay within one's own states?
Well, that's what I thought as a leftist, all my life. Yeah. But in this weird Russiagate era, things have been flipped a little bit, where now you have, at least in the U.S., you have the Democrats right now who are, in sometimes, not all the time, more hawkish than Republicans. And you have more Republicans right now speaking out. Like you have this Republican senator named Josh Hawley saying that Ukraine shouldn't join NATO. And then the White House responded by saying he was repeating Russian talking points. So it's strange. You've had this kind of reversal in that way, and it's weird. I mean, for me, it's strange. Like, I can go on Tucker Carlson on Fox News, which is a right-wing network, and I can say the things that I say. I just went on a few days ago and talked about what's driving this conflict is U.S. hegemony. And I would never get invited on CNN or MSNBC to say that. Even to some lefty YouTube shows, I couldn't even get on to say that. So it's weird. It's a weird time. And
it's like the floor's moving beneath your feet.
Yes, and I hope that changes, because the left that I've always identified with is opposed to militarism and war.
It's a tough one though, because there have to be some circumstances. I know Iraq is often pointed out as one of those where it was a terrible decision to. I think it's almost like everyone says it's the worst decision ever to go in there. But at the same time, I mean, not that they should have done, but it's a difficult one because Saddam, as far as I know, was just like murdering Kurdish people and like had this brutal regime. And do we just sit there and go, okay, well, that's them?
Well, look, that's a great question, but the fact is, we know what the U.S. did when Saddam Hussein was murdering Kurds, gassing them. The U.S. was giving him the weapons to do that. That was back when Saddam Hussein was an ally. His worst atrocities all committed when he was a U.S. ally. So the answer then was to stop supporting it. It's never to invade a country and destroy it. And the consequences of Iraq we're still feeling today. I mean, it not only caused untold suffering inside Iraq, and by the way, not just with the war, but before that with the sanctions that the U.S. imposed on Iraq, which were murderous, killed many children. And there's that famous clip, like going back to your question before, but do U.S. leaders know what they're doing? There's a clip of Madeleine Albright where she's asked about kids dying in Iraq of U.S. sanctions. And the figure back then was thought to be hundreds of thousands. And that figure was probably off. It was exaggerated because there's been studies showing that it was less. There was still a lot of kids. A lot of Iraqi kids were dying under U.S. sanctions. And Madeleine Albright said, we think the price is worth it. So that's the U.S. real attitude towards Iraq, and the real level of concern they have for Iraqi civilians is they think it's worth it to kill Iraqi kids if it serves their interest. And yeah, in the case of Saddam Hussein, he was a really horrible person, but the worst atrocities he committed were with U.S. support. So then does that mean we should then support someone invading the U.S. and bombing it and sanctioning it to stop U.S. support for Saddam's mass murder? Of course not, And so the answer back then was to support weapons inspections and drop the sanctions and let Iraqis take care of Saddam. Let people deal with their own issues. And because what right do we have to invade and bomb people, And the consequences of that are still being felt. I mean, not just to Iraq, but to the entire Middle East now.
It's a bit of a separate point, but I heard the other day that Saddam's son used to keep like monkeys in cages and would like torture people in those cages.
Well, that was a horrible regime. I wouldn't be surprised. I also, the problem is with it, it's as soon as someone is designated to be an official enemy, then you'll have a whole bunch of propaganda about them too. So, for example, back during the first Gulf War, Iraqi soldiers were accused of ripping Kuwaiti babies out of incubators, and there was even testimony before Congress to that effect, and that turned out to be a giant scam. So, I wouldn't, I don't want to minimize the brutality of Saddam Hussein's regime, but you always just got to be at least wonder if something is coming from facts or coming from some CIA agent's imagination.
Sure. What happens now then? Does it just disappear like it was a figment of our imagination, or do things intensify in the coming months and years in Russia and Ukraine?
Well, it actually looks like there's going to, if I were to predict, I think there's going to be diplomacy. I think, look, a major reason why we're here in the situation right now is, you can blame the coup that happened in 2014. That happened under Obama, and that was a major problem. But under Trump came in, and while everybody in Washington, like all the Democrats and MSNBC, CNN were accusing him of, and Christopher Steele and Luke Harding of The Guardian were accusing him of being a Russian puppet, Trump was actually presiding over one of the most hawkish administrations towards Russia in recent memory. More hawkish, I think, than even Obama was. He was tearing, and included in that was tearing up vital arms accords treaties. And that's one of the reasons why I was so against Russiagate and was warning so much about how dangerous it was, is that while everyone was accusing Trump of being a Russian puppet, he was tearing up the treaties that are preventing nuclear war. And if you believe so strongly that this guy is a Russian puppet, that's going to incentivize you to look away when he does things that are actually challenging to Russia. And in the case of what Trump was actually doing, it was not only challenging to Russia and tearing up these vital arms accords deals, but it was threatening human survival, because we need these nuclear accords to stay safe. And so I think the Biden administration has recognized how reckless Trump was in tearing up these vital accords. So the first thing he did in coming into office in 2021 was restoring the New START treaty, which was about to expire. That's the last treaty remaining that limits the nuclear stockpiles of both countries. So I do think that this crisis will hopefully lead, at least, if I'm being optimistic, to more talks and restoring some of the arms control that was torn up under Trump. And will there be any meaningful movement in Ukraine? There could be. If the U.S. said to Ukraine, to Kiev, look, you got to implement the Minsk Accords. It just means you grant the Donbass, this Russian-speaking region, autonomy, and in return for that, they get demilitarized. And you do that because you're not going to join NATO anyway. Because, by the way, that's the whole thing. As much as the U.S. says, we need to, keep everyone's ability to join NATO up to them. We don't want to rule anything out. Everyone knows that Ukraine is not going to join NATO because it's too corrupt, it's too divided, and it's too dangerous. So it's like, just for this stupid kind of arrogance where the U.S. doesn't want to give Russia a win, they're blocking a resolution that they kind of agree to anyway, because they actually don't think Ukraine will even join NATO. So it wouldn't be difficult if all the parties wanted to come up with some kind of negotiation that lets everybody save face.
Aaron, it's been a really fascinating, insightful half hour. I've learned a lot. Thank you. Where can people find you quickly?
I'm at The Gray Zone, thegrayzone.com, and on Substack at nate.substack.com. And since you're in the UK, shout out to Manchester, where my grandmother is.
I will shout to Manchester for you. Thank you so much, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks for having me.
Here we go, folks. Where's
Helen Zaremus with ABC News. Helen Zaremus with AVAX COVID vaccine has now arrived in Australia. COVID vaccine has now tonight the first of 51 million doses tonight. The vaccine regulator approved the use of Novavax, the vaccine regulator 18 and over, last month. The shipment 18 and over last month and then distributed to GPs, pharmacies and state hubs and then distributed to GPs later this month. Tourism chiefs say later this month sector to get back on its feet after a decision to get back on its feet international borders to tourists. From the 21st of February, borders to tourists, business travellers, family and friends will be welcomed back to Australia. Every traveller will need to be double vaxxed. Margie Osmond from the Tourism and Transport Forum says it's a thrill to have an opening date.
We need to market Australia and the individual states very aggressively because this is now a very competitive global market with every other country in the world looking for those leisure tourists as well, and many of them having the head start on us.
A bill to protect religious freedom will be the top priority for the federal government when Parliament resumes sitting today for the first time this year. With only limited parliamentary days left before an election has to be called, the federal government is trying to deliver on its promise to pass the proposed protections. But there are divisions within the Liberal Party about whether the bill goes too far and could protect people making discriminatory statements on other grounds, such as sexuality or gender. Liberal Senator Eric Abetz says it's important an agreement's reached so the federal government can honour its commitment.
The bottom line is that religious freedom does need to be protected, and in relation to schooling, ultimately it should be up to mums and dads to determine the basic ethos of the school.
The Department of Foreign Affairs says an Australian-Chinese dual citizen is being prosecuted under Hong Kong's sweeping national security law. More from Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts.
The department said last year that an Australian had been detained under the law, but now it's given more details. The man was arrested in January last year when China intensified its crackdown on pro-democracy figures. The ABC's been told the man has been detained for lengthy periods since then. The department has not said what charges he's facing, but the national security law gives the authorities broad powers to impose heavy penalties, including life imprisonment. The department has also revealed that Australian officials have been repeatedly refused consular access to the man.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron are holding talks in Moscow amid the continuing tension over Ukraine. Mr. Macron says he hopes the talks will start a process of de-escalation. More from the BBC's Carolyn Davis.
What was described earlier by the Kremlin as likely to be substantial and lengthy talks. There were images of the two sitting down the opposite ends of what looks like a very large table. President Putin began by talking about the fact that this was the first time that they'd sat down together over the course of the last 2 years. Crucially, what is getting some attention already is the fact that President Putin has said, we have common concerns over what's happening in the sphere of security in Europe. I would like to thank you that France always takes the most active part in drawing up fundamental decisions in this area.
To sport, the Australian women's cricket captain Elisa Healy says the most pleasing aspect of the summer has been her team's resilience as she looks ahead to the World Cup in New Zealand next month. The final one-dayer in the Women's Ashes will be played in Melbourne today, and the home side has already secured the series, but England didn't make it easy. Healy says her side's ability to scrap for results bodes well.
Get ourselves out of a corner, I think is the best way to put it. I mean, we've won games that it hasn't looked like we've been able to win. I mean, we drew the test match when it looked like we weren't going to win that as well.
And Aussie speed skater Brendan Corey has crashed out of his 1,000-metre short track speed skating quarter-final at the Beijing Winter Olympics. Corey was penalised for taking out two skaters on the final corner, including the eventual gold medalist Ren Zai Wei. The Aussie had been sitting in third place and was looking to move up, but caught his lead skate on Ren, sending all three into the barriers. ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
Good morning, I'm Ali Crew. Thanks for joining us on this Tuesday, the 8th of February. Coming up, Prime Minister Scott Morrison to send the Army into aged care homes as they grapple with crippling staff shortages.
This will help in the near term in many sites where there's current pressures on the existing workforce, and that's welcome.
And in Canada, a state of emergency declared as the country's capital as a protest against COVID restrictions paralyses much of the city. All the details just ahead. The aged care sector and unions are welcoming the deployment of Defence Forces into nursing homes, but are warning it's still not enough to fill thousands of vacancies. After weeks of resisting calling in the ADF, the federal government is making up to 1,700 personnel available to help stabilise COVID outbreaks and help ease staff shortages, as Annie Guest reports.
Lynette Jacker says her 94-year-old mum has deteriorated dramatically during COVID lockdowns at her nursing home on the New South Wales Central Coast.
You've got depression, you've got isolation, total withdrawal.
And she suspects some of the lockdowns were imposed because of staff shortages.
Once they opened up the home, you could come in and you could see that the state of the place wasn't the same. The carpets were soiled. They still had food on the floor in Mum's room. That sort of thing had never happened before.
Aged and Community Services Australia, which represents not-for-profit nursing homes, estimates up to 140,000 shifts are unfilled each week in residential aged care. The federal government is sending in up to 1,700 Defence Force personnel to provide clinical, logistical and general support to facilities facing acute staff shortages.
I think the ADF is a great idea because it's not going to attack the systemic problems that are in aged care. I think it's a band-aid response that could have been thought out better.
There'll be an initial 4 teams of 10 ADF personnel, including a registered nurse, to help with the management of waste, protective equipment and other general duties in homes in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Queensland. Centre operators and unions have been calling
Insights here on Kalkine TV.
So Sean Rooney from the Peak Group leading age services welcomes the news.
This will help in the near term in many sites with this current pressures on the existing
collectively known as Open Plus, agreed on the 2nd of February to boost the crude oil production quota for the 8th consecutive month. That's amid ongoing tight supplies and skyrocketing oil prices. The world is facing a crude oil supply crunch as leading oil producers struggle to keep up
wary
production
of the government
due to underinvestment and the ongoing political unrest between the US and Russia over Ukraine issues. Sticking to its original plan of gradually enhancing production, the cartel has agreed to pump up the output by an additional 400,000 barrels per day in March. At the end of December 2021, oil production was nearly 824,000 barrels per day, lower than its target.
Jared Hayes from the Health Services Union says the ADF
according to the International Energy Agency data,
1,700 clearly is nowhere near the answer.
250,000 barrels per day in December on account of lower than anticipated production across Angola, Nigeria, Malaysia and Russia. However, on a broader scale, the cartels plan to gradually increase the output.
He thinks a better interim measure would be to ask local charities like
7-year
Lions and
highs in January,
Rotary to help not with personal care, but with providing recreational activities.
With this backdrop, let's take a look at the performance of 3 ASX-listed oil players. Firstly, Woodside Petroleum. They've decided to withdraw their interest in Myanmar. The company holds a 40% participating interest in the A6 joint venture and AD1 and AD8 exploration permits. On the 16th of December 2021, the company announced that its proposed acquisition of BHP Petroleum was not opposed by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. Moving on, and Santos has posted record numbers across metrics, sales revenue, annual production, and also free cash flow in the fourth quarter.
The discussion follows a letter the industry sent.
The company delivered a record yearly production of 92.1 million barrels of oil equivalent and 6.4 million liquefied natural gas sales in 2021. In December, the company announced that the merger of oil searches and Santos was affected by a scheme of arrangement under the President law implemented on the 17th of December. In January, Ampol provided an update on the performance of its Lytton refinery for the fourth quarter of 2021. The Lytton refiner margin was $11.24 per barrel, significantly higher than the first quarter margin of $6.76 per barrel. Additionally, refinery production was also vital to the period. In December, Ampol announced the sale of 24 freehold convenience retail sites to Charter Hall Retail REIT. Oil and gas players across the globe have been benefiting from the ongoing oil rally, underpinned by a supply shortage and political unrest in the world's leading economies. Well, that's all for now. We'll be back again with the exclusive Hot Performer Show. Till then, keep watching Kalkine TV for the latest market updates and related insights. I'm Rachel, signing off for now.
The U.S. is getting a big new player in air travel. Frontier Airlines and Spirit Airlines have agreed to merge in a $2.9 billion deal that will create the fifth largest U.S. carrier. The two companies expect the cash and stock deal to help accelerate investment and take on traditional champions like United and American Airlines. It's expected to create 10,000 jobs by 2026 and deliver $1 billion in annual savings. Frontier will be in the driver's seat, owning just over half of the combined entity. The announcement comes as major U.S. carriers look forward to a profitable 2022. Flight demand has rebounded as economies reopen and lockdowns ease. For now, there's no name for the new company. Both airlines operate Airbus jets, easing the challenge of integrating their two fleets.
Or aspiring to a leadership position within Europe in handling this crisis, and there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, France currently holds the rotating presidency of the European Union, so to some extent it's in that kind of capacity that we see Macron making this visit. But also there's the aspect of what's been happening in Germany, in that Angela Merkel, after 16 years in office, where she was really this kind of dominating figure in foreign policy in Europe, is no longer in office here. Olaf Scholz, her successor, is finding his feet currently. He's actually on a visit to Washington, so we see Macron stepping in, at least to an extent, into a sort of senior figure in European politics, into that kind of role. And you've really seen a huge amount of activity from him in recent days, obviously so much. He stands out as the Western leader who's spoken most frequently, in particular to Vladimir Putin. Plus, in addition to all of that, this is an election year in France, so there are incentives for Macron. If he can find some kind of way forward here, there could be a big political upside for him.
In his letter to staff, Spotify CEO said he would be committing to investing in content from historically marginalized groups
do to potentially calm these tensions.
While some might want us to pursue a different path, I believe that more speech on more issues can be highly
so what
effective
do we
in
expect
improving
Macron
the
might be able
status
to
quo
bring to the
and
table to
enhancing the
de-escalate the
conversation
situation?
together. For more on the story,
there's a lot of
speculation
about that at the moment.
And for the latest entertainment news and updates, keep watching the
What really stands out is that Macron is, of the Western leaders, the one so far who has made it clearest, at least between the lines, that he is willing to find a really kind of new
Call to Communion
bargain
in
with
progress
Vladimir
here on
Putin
this
over
Monday
European
afternoon
security, and
here
seeing
on
this crisis is
EWTN
more
Radio.
about
Going now to
Ukraine,
Lloyd in Brooklyn, also
about
watching
the
on
entire
EWTN
settlement
television.
of European
Hey Lloyd,
security,
what's on your mind today,
that
sir?
emerged after the end of the Cold
Oh,
War.
fine, thank you.
Now, this has raised
How
some
can we help you?
concerns,
Yes.
particularly among Eastern European
concerned
allies,
about
who are concerned that this may be a sign that
when we partake of the
Macron
body
is
and
minded
blood
to offer
of Jesus,
concessions to Vladimir Putin that could
Eucharist,
come
we
at the cost of
actually
Western
take
unity,
taking
that
of the
could
body
put their own
itself,
security
blood
at
of
risk.
Jesus.
So Macron is under
Does
a
this
lot of
make
pressure
us
to reassure Eastern
a cannibal?
Thank you.
And if we are, why not?
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate the question. I really appreciate the question. And no, we're not cannibals. This is what a cannibal does. A cannibal, first of all, identifies the victim, kills the victim, cooks the victim, usually, dismembers the victim, masticates the victim, chews, swallows, digests, and metabolizes the victim.
vaccinated travellers.
We do none of those
coming
things.
into effect on the 21st of
So,
February.
with
The news has
respect
been
to the
welcomed
Eucharist,
by the tourism
we are
industry,
not-
which has been
we are
crying
not,
out for movement on the
predators
border
who are
closure.
seeking out some hapless victim that we can kill. We kill no one.
And in Western
Jesus
Australia,
not
the
killed by
government
us.
has eased its isolation rules as it manages
we
more
do
than
not
250
dismember
active
Christ.
COVID cases.
We don't break him
Close
apart.
contact rules have
we're
been
certainly
watered
not
down to
cooking
only
him.
include those in the same
And,
house. The isolation period has been halved to 7
form of the
days.
Blessed Sacrament
Vaccinated international
does not
arrivals will also
include
now skip
the
hotel
normal
quarantine and
process of
self-isolate at
digestion
home.
that pertains to human food. So the crushing of my teeth does not crush the body of Christ
Protesters in
such that
Canada's
it
capital say
dissolves.
they'll continue
The body
to
of
rally
Christ itself,
indefinitely
the
as the city
species
declares a
dissolves,
state
but
of
the
emergency.
body and blood of Christ
Hundreds
are
of trucks
intact
remain in Ottawa
and
as part of the
undamaged by
so-called
me.
Freedom Convoy.
Secondly, when
Protesting
I
against
swallow the
vaccination
so
mandates rolled out across
I
the
do not
country.
and also
metabolize
so
the Son
fascinating.
of God.
It was like we were
various
redefining how in front of our eyes
my body, the way that I should say because the
from now, I mean, I know
real
it's kind of
presence
always
is that as soon as the
but like there was this sort of
appearance
mass
of wine
redefinition.
is gone,
Curiosity
so is the
was less important than instant judgment, and a slither of like some words in a tweet
there is no
meant that we
other
could define the
substantial presence in the universe
define
like
that person
the substantial
absolutely.
presence of Christ in the universe.
You know, like we were amateur
in the
sleuths.
sacred books.
And so I wrote a book that was very critical of
let's
that
talk
in
about
many
the nature
different
of
ways.
Christ's presence.
But, you know,
We
cancel
teach
culture
in the
kind of
Catholic faith that
includes
he
all
is
of that
substantially
stuff.
present
It also includes
body,
people
blood, soul,
in
and
the
divinity.
middle, like
But
Ashram
none of the
provocative,
properties
like
of
some
Christ's
fucked
body, none of the
get an
accidents
awful
of
lot of
Christ's body
pushback,
are
and
present.
then they say that
What
can
are
be
some of the
cancelled.
accidents
Now that's more
of a body?
complicated because
Well,
on the one hand,
extension in space.
yelling at Ashram provocative.
So, for example, you extend me,
like
put me
I
on
used
the
to
rack.
be a columnist and was
You know,
yelled at
I'm
all
about
the time.
5'10".
So
Be
I think,
5'11" and a half. I've shrunk
and also they're
over
public
the course of my
figures.
lifetime.
So
Record of the same name back in 2016. A.R. Wilson in there too, aka the project of Andras, aka Art Wilson. They're exploring some songs from the Gold Rush era and replicating them using entirely electronics, despite the fact that it did sound like there were a few guitars and banjos and harmonicas going on in the background there. To challenge himself to replicate those sort of gold rushy musical sounds using exclusively electronics and software. We took the track from his album Old Gold, which is out now and also happens to be our feature album this week here at PBS. That was a track called Moonlight Flat, and at the very top we did hear from Stairway, an ambient project which is actually an offshoot of the Yardbirds, a terrific 60s group. Apparently when they reunited in the 80s for a couple of shows, the drummer and the bass player, the Yardbirds, are teaming up to create that ambient soundscapey project called Stairway. The album was called Moonstone, released in 1988, and we kicked off the program with that track there called Blue
I discovered it all.
Good morning, if you've just joined me, you're listening to The Breakfast Spread. It's about 18 minutes past 6 o'clock on Tuesday morning. We're going to check in with a wonderful artist from Australia by the name of Martha Marlowe. She put out this album at the very beginning of I believe it was, called Medicine Man. The name of the track is called I Am.
Level one,
extension in space, divisibility, weight. You know, there aren't 160 pounds of Jesus stuff. All of those things would be necessary for me to actually approach the body of Christ as a candle, to ritually consume the body so that it could be incorporated nutritional.
Former head of Britain's armed forces says the West should formally recognise the Taliban administration in Afghanistan. General Sir David Richards says it's time to accept that war has been lost and work with the country's new leaders to protect the Afghan people. The UK government says the Taliban needs to abide by international norms if it wants international acceptance. BBC's John Simpson.
What's going on? Just
Afghanistan is facing the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. In cities like Kabul, there's no actual shortage of food, but people don't have the cash to buy it. As a result, up to 8 million people are facing starvation. The economy has simply collapsed. The West has frozen Afghanistan's financial assets, nearly $10 billion worth. And because some of the Taliban leadership are still classed.
So when these ideas then are tried and tested, what's the outcome for some of these experts?
The country has virtually run out of cash.
Wow, so say that again.
So when these ideas are actually put to the test, what's the outcome for the so-called experts?
He was a minister in the previous government, but he felt it was his duty to stay on and work with the country's new masters.
I should say, by the way, these were signal shows. These are going to step well things to be this is called Dragon in Carolina. So sometimes when they
one senior British military figure, General Sir David Richards, formerly Chief of the Defence Staff,
so they had ways of staying gainfully employed.
Former enemies.
Yeah, well, it's funny you should say that.
Some of these that's not how love works.
If that's the case, we better get on to that sooner rather than later.
There's a great but there were actually
I think this is an occasion for us to be magnanimous indeed.
I came to Kosa, a village
and it lasted like 20 years.
in the west of the country.
Is that we
Like everything else, over the past 4 years, Afghanistan has suffered from a devastating drought. People here can't grow food any longer. Now they have to queue for handouts. She's the one, Dr. Kasia Azimi, was overseeing the food distribution.
And I feel like it's so sad to see how dependent people are and how desperate people are.
Now,
I have a lot of emotions when it comes to the level of desperation people go through in this period of time. It's one of the most difficult times I've ever seen in my life.
The UK government says it's providing
but they don't tell me the intellect doesn't come to judgment. There's no way this has to be true. Nothing else could possibly be true because it doesn't work that way. I mean, I wasn't present at the resurrection.
We really do
if I had been,
I would say that the President's
all
of our news and information that Dr. Leonard will abide by making changes that he would
I do have a choice.
to account to comply fully with the steps that needed to be taken. I can see if there's more specific details. I certainly understand why you're asking. But overall, it's ensuring that he is creating a work environment that people feel safe, they feel supported, and that is respectful. And that is the overarching policy that needs to be implemented moving forward. You saw him send a note to staff last week. Now it is whether he is implementing those policies moving forward. I don't have any conversations between the beginning of the internet. There was this scandal about
they were to ban what you said isn't a split between Ukraine
so
and your business message on the risk of an invasion. Can you walk us through the communication strategy, like when you're trying to highlight the risk of invasion and why you're trying to highlight it more strongly than Ukraine? Do you see it as sounding the alarm more vocally? Is there an advantage that you see in sort of preventing Putin from taking any further steps here?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I can't speak for the communication strategy of the Ukrainians. Only they can speak for that. But I can tell you that what we have been trying to do, we obviously have a range of information, a broad range of information that we have been able to gather here, and also through partnership with our allies across the country. Our objective, as we talked about a little bit on Friday, is to deny Russia the opportunity to use some of the tactics, sometimes some of the lies, that they have done in the past to justify an invasion of Ukraine. That's straight out of their playbook. We have seen tactics they have used in the past, where a few years ago, Russia's defense ministry falsely accused the United States of running a clandestine biological weapons lab in the country of Georgia, enabling their efforts to destabilize the Georgian government. They used to fabricate stories in Syria about how attacks on international aid convoys were undertaken by rebels or terrorists. We have undertaken an effort to, in some cases, declassify information, in other cases, describe in as great a detail as we can without putting at resources and methods what we're seeing, what information we're evaluating, so that it makes it more difficult for them to do. So that is why we're doing it. I also know that a number of their news organizations have reporters near there who are seeing the truth build up, right? So there is justification and validation from even that, but also from our partners around the world as well. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah Manchin expressed confidence over the weekend that reform the Electoral Count Act will pass. Would the President be supportive of the reforms Electoral Count Act if they were to pass, or would he require that there be elements of the bill, voting rights bill, included in order to do so?
Well, I would really point you to Senator Klobuchar, who is really one of the point people leading this effort. Obviously, we have said many times that the Electoral Count Act, while we support the effort, is not a replacement for voting rights legislation for a range of reasons. I know there's a lot of discussions on the Hill about what that may look like or what a final package. I can't outline that from here.
When we drove into the gate to carry the Olympic torch during the opening ceremony of the Games in Beijing, what did the administration make of that, given the ongoing genocide against Uyghurs in Xinjiang?
Well, I know that our UN ambassador, Thomas Greenfield, spoke to this yesterday. That was to reiterate some very powerful comments, if I'm remembering. I know someone spoke to it, but I believe it was her. That we can't allow this to be a distraction from exactly as you said, the human rights abuses, the genocide that we're seeing in parts of China. That is why we did not send a diplomatic delegation, even as we're cheering for our U.S. athletes. Diplomacy is complicated, as we know, but we can't allow it to be a distraction from what we know is happening to many people in China. Go ahead.
Just to reiterate, on inauguration day, President Biden said he would fire anyone that treat another colleague with disrespect. And they would fire them on the spot. No ifs, ands, or buts.
You kept in touch with him, or
White House's message
you kept in touch with
to people that
AJ?
work in this building and throughout the federal government that took the president at his word. I don't understand why Dr. Lander has not been fired.
The message, and thank you for your question, is that the president has crystal clear expectations with all of us about how we are to treat our colleagues, treat people who work for us, and that is what he expects from people across the building. It is because of those comments that he made early on, in part, that we put in place a safety that a voting mechanism for which and it also, it is based on that, that through investigation from that came the meeting that Dr. Lander had with senior White House officials, where it was made clear what steps he was required to take. And that
So Jamie has asked a question tying into what we're talking about.
And our objective is, of course, to prevent any of this behavior
Does
from
that
happening
connect to the
again
growth?
in the future. That's the overarching objective.
That's what I promised.
Absolutely, that's why we put in place a policy to ensure there's a mechanism for investigating and a mechanism for preventing this type of behavior from repeating itself.
I was in Belfast to fire people that did this, and he hasn't fired the individual the White House found violated what he said.
I understand it, and again, let me just reiterate, nothing about his behavior is acceptable to anyone here at all. Quite the opposite. Let me be clear about that. But there is now a process in place that was not in place at the time to evaluate and determine what the next steps should be taken in the event that any behavior like this occurs to prevent it from happening in the future. That is exactly what happened in the future.
Employees shouldn't expect that people will be fired and they treat colleagues with respect.
Again, I think I've outlined very clearly what the process was. Go ahead.
Two questions for you.
It's more than that. I think it's clear that we are putting in place, we put in place a process, an internal process, to ensure that there was a thorough investigation, that it was evaluated, that steps were taken for this individual, Dr. Lander, to meet with senior officials, to make clear that there were requirements that would be put in place, and he was expected to comply with them to prevent this behavior from ever happening again. Go ahead.
after a NATO,
First, on Senator Manchin, on Build Back Better, he's reiterated again his view that that structure is done. And he said he wants regular order for any pieces of that that will move forward. That means potentially weeks, hearings, all of that. Is the president on board with that idea of hearings, markups, and if not, what's his plan for elements of Build Back Better to move forward?
Well, I can't speak for Senator Manchin. No, you're not asking me to, but what there is broad agreement on and support for is taking steps to lower costs for the American people, whether it's Medicare or whether it's ability to negotiate the price of prescription drugs, something broadly supported, whether it's lowering the cost of child care, elder care, making sure that the tax system is more fair. In terms of the mechanisms and legislative process, I just don't have any more predictions for you in terms of how we'll proceed.
Positive report on Friday by and large. However, black unemployment is still twice the rate of white unemployment. What is the White House doing? What does the White House think needs to be done to deal with that, especially for black men?
Well, I would say it just is a reminder that there's still, as much as the President oversaw the largest creation of job creation ever in 1 year in American history, it means there's more work to be done. Because there are still a lot of work that needs to be done to level the playing field, to ensure that small businesses have the assistance they need, including black-owned small businesses, that we are doing everything we can to ensure there is opportunity for a range of parts of the economic world. Go ahead.
A few on the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Congressman Clark.
I've been, you know, a lot of my separation on the is coming from Katie Hughes. I've been Jesse Tinkle's podcast, Blocks Reported, which I enjoy very much. And so they've led me, to the world of
agrees with. I think you all have seen many iterations of the Build Back Better legislation.
I've been fascinated by the whole YA.
One of the reasons why I personally tend to shy away from watching these kinds of dramatic reenactments. I'm not saying other people shouldn't be. That's my own spirituality, my own choice for myself. But another reason is that invariably the directors, they add these emendations, they make these historical judgments, and they put them in the text, and they put them in the film, and then people watching it don't know. Is this representation scriptural? Is this canonical? This kind of raises confusions. So this Lilliput is one of those. Now, the name Lilith comes to us from Jewish tradition. And there is a Jewish legend that Adam had a wife before Eve. Now, this is not canonical scripture. There's no part of the Christian Bible and no part of the Christian faith. This part of Jewish legend that there was a character named Lilith. Now,
they drove everybody out of business and then bought all those companies back for pennies on the dollar. Could you explain? Could you explain that in detail, please? Because I was riveted listening to that.
Right. Yeah, what you just said about
the DMCA. I don't know. I just raised that question in my mind, but this is clearly no part of the gospel narrative.
Okay, well there you go. Nancy, thank you so much for your call today.
Just reminded me
Communion
when I was
here on EWTN Radio. Let's go to Matt now. Matt is in Morgantown, West Virginia, listening on Light of Life Radio, one of our great partners there. Hey Matt, what's on your mind today, sir?
It goes faster than you can cut it down. I'm thinking, as a child, I could imagine that he's keen to people like stop the activities.
We have been engaging with, civil rights.
So basically,
how did Pornhub even start? Let's set the table.
How did Pornhub start? Okay. It started off with which were these two brothers. Forgive me if I'm a little rusty on the early history. But Mansett was these two brothers who were running a sort of fledgling porn. They became quite strict Muslim family, and their parents didn't know what they were doing. Like, they knew it was something to do with the internet.
Sure, I understand
but
the
they
question.
didn't know, and they'd have a code word.
So,
that, like, if their parents came in, they'd shout out the code word, everyone would have to turn off their computers.
Catechism still stands as the authoritative norm for Catholic teaching. The various councils, not just those councils that the Anglican Church accepts, but the councils up to and including the Second Vatican Council are still both extraordinary and ordinary magisterial teaching. The patrimony of hatred theology, especially since Leo XIII, this genre
walked right into that one. I walked right into that one.
Remains.
Obviously,
in print, online, available, and authoritative for Catholic life.
So, but then he got a loan
teaching on marriage and sexuality
from the hedge fund to go into the struggling valley, struggling because the poor buy
The number of Chinese Air Force incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone have gone up, as has the rhetoric of the regime. China views Taiwan as a renegade province that needs to be reunited with the mainland. This has forced Taiwan to double down on modernizing its own military. More on that in a moment, but first a look at how some members of Taiwan's elite amphibious reconnaissance and patrol unit, the ARP, are being tested to see if they are good enough to join the Marine Corps' elite force of frogmen.
But anyway, now he's
This is the final exercise of a brutal training course.
Between the 14th and 15th century,
The Marines call it the road to heaven.
There were some good card players.
Getting over the line is not to be taken for granted. More than half of the 30-year-old candidates failed to finish.
John 22nd, who was
This 26-year-old graduate says he knows what it takes to succeed.
The first 3 days are very exhausting, but during the last few days it gets better. Your body gets used to it. But of course you have to rely on your willpower and determination.
So, but I thought during
The training is designed to test the stamina of Marines and to eliminate those unable to withstand the pressure. All of those taking part volunteered to do so. Some out of a feeling of patriotism, others are keen to push themselves to their limits.
About some of the actresses.
Exercises include spending hours in the water after having had very little food or sleep.
The main reason for being so harsh to them is to train their willpower, because our unit belongs to the Special Forces. So in times of war, we need to have stronger willpower and better physical abilities than other units.
The foremen of the elite force are among those who would be deployed in the event of any conflict with China, which has been increasing military pressure on Taiwan of late. They would be expected to scout enemy locations, perform attacks. For such tasks, the trainer said, they may need to be able to cope with the harshest and
Tomorrow's are you experiencing
military confrontation with China seriously. I think over time people have been simply the possibility of a shadow of the Chinese military confrontation scenario easily over quarters into So I think over time people just begin to try to choose out this line for the most part. And I think the general public has
So then,
they have leaders and those who are military, they do
to make money while they're waiting to
Did you watch Boogie Nights?
Oh yeah. And actually, I think it's
yes,
What would you say are your all-time favorite documentaries?
Nick Broomfield's The Leader of Drivers. That's the documentary that got me into it. Broomfield goes to South Africa neo-Nazi leaders and didn't last months and they just didn't seriously the whole documentary is beauty dead
simply living under the possibility or the shadow of the Chinese military confrontation scenario easily over a quarter century by now. So I think over time people just begin to try to tune out with their lives for the most part. And I think for the general public that then has a sense they have obviously for the government leaders and those who are in the military, they do
he was the first person who left us.
Militarily, I mean, we look at military modernization that Taiwan is undergoing. I wonder if that is the cornerstone of Taiwan's strategy to counter it.
Yes, I mean, Taiwan's strategy towards managing the military threat from China are essentially two prongs. You can talk about it in terms of military modernization of Taiwan's forces itself, as well as more international and diplomatic endeavors. So just to talk about, I think the first point, Taiwan's own autonomous military capacity. Taiwan obviously knows that China is easily like 50, 60 times bigger than itself in population terms. So Taiwan is not going to try to outspend China down the $1 in terms of military procurement. Instead, what Taiwan tries to do is to find ways that we can cultivate niche capacity. So we talk about, for example, this thing called asymmetric warfare ability, where Taiwan tries to increase things like missile launchers, more defensive ballistic missile defense systems, sea mines, and other ways like that, where Taiwan can kind of get defensive capacity on the cheap. In addition to that as well, there is something to be said about finding ways to boost Taiwan's own reserve forces. And just at the end of last year, Taiwan was going ahead in terms of doing reform to its reformed reserve forces structure, so as to sort of park part of that military capacity in the civilian everyday economy, so as to keep it more sustainable.
Now, Defense Minister Chiu Kuo-cheng last year said in October that tensions with China are at their worst in 4 decades. Does Taipei see these getting worse this year?
Well, Taipei certainly believes that there's no more need to take it even more seriously than it had in the past. I would say that in terms of actual degree of threat assessment, Taiwan is largely alert but not alarmed at the moment. The primary reason being that in order for China to launch a successful invasion of Taiwan, China still has a long way to go in terms of developing the amphibious landing capacity and transportation capacity across the Taiwan Strait before an actual occupation could happen. So in that front, Taiwan is still relatively confident that it's able to hold off the Chinese offensive. But meanwhile, all this intensification of military planes, Chinese warplanes near Taiwan Strait do create greater risk of escalation as well as accidental escalation when things will get out of control.
We'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you so much for joining us today. Benty Sung from the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific. Thank you so much.
Particularly when it pertains to questions of their relics.
Both have got fairly resilient demand. They're
critics
able to have some pricing power and
Catholic and non-Catholic.
The local market was resilient today. The All Ords added 0.6%, and it's up 2% for the week, which is the first positive week since December. Wall Street was sucker-punched overnight with shares in Facebook, now called Meta, plunging 26% after results show people are turning away from the social media platform. It lost $250 billion in value. European markets fell after the Bank of England lifted interest rates by 25 basis points and the ECB edged closer to hiking as well. While on commodity markets, the threat of supply cuts keep oil and gas climbing. Now, today's release of the RBA's detailed economic forecasts confirms the banks had a significant rethink since last August, unsurprisingly. The following charts compare August's forecasts with today's. Economic growth has been scaled back, with GDP now set to peak at 5% instead of 5.5%. Inflation is now tipped to peak at 3.75%. That's a full 1% higher than the previous forecast and well and truly above the bank's target. But wages are only expected to advance by 2.75% this year and not hit their peak of above 3% until 2024. Now that's well behind the price inflation, and while the RBA points out that it will be the fastest pace that wages have grown in a decade, it will surely feel like snail's pace for households facing steep price increases for essentials right now. Still on wages, while the RBA has its view on where pay packets are headed, so do economists, unions and households. Now most optimistic are economists. Unions are in the middle, while households are expecting very little extra from their employers. Who'll be right? That's finance.
TPG trades at 8 times. And they have a similar, asset base which they could then, sell a stake in to crystallise some value. They don't do that. Accelerate the increase.
I don't know, maybe he'll be so busy.
Okay, over to you, Bruce. Which two sectors are you overweight in 2022 and why?
One day. Hope not.
At the moment, Ali, we're certainly overweight energy. We think with energy transition dominating the headlines.
Tony Community is tonight saying no more to anyone with plans to build and says it's an effort to protect mountain lions. As NBC Bears comes in from tells us town leaders say the Cougars need the land more than the people do. But not everyone's buying that.
It's been an issue for years up and down the peninsula. Cougars coming into contact with communities, and it's not just in Woodside.
You see not enough lands in Redwood City and San Bruno and places. Okay.
Biologists say the run-ins between the big cats and humans are inevitable as cities and towns intrude more and more on wildlife habitat. Now it's on the Woodside communities all rebuilding as they say nothing need the land to survive. Species are under the same protections as endangered species. Town leaders say they can invoke protections to help building. The movement prohibits owners of larger properties from splitting their land to develop new housing. It's desperately needed and encouraged by Senator O'Connor. State Senator Scott Weaver is cooperative on Senator Tweed Court. He says people need homes too, and he projects legal capital to this moratorium on building. In an interview with the Almanac newspaper, Mayor Dick Brown says every house that's built is one more acre taken away from habitat. But some place this island will be like this is a great job. That's why Woods is getting house in the middle of
Well, that's all we have time for today. We hope you enjoyed that episode of Bible Cell. I'd love to know what stocks you're backing this year ahead. Let us know in the comments section below. And if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, we're adding new content every week.
Extensive studies in academic political science, mainstream, which ask a very simple question.
Assault allegations, but its foreign ministry said it hoped the, quote, malicious speculation about her would stop. Sunday's L'Equipe report is not the first time Peng has said she never made the accusation of assault. But now, in telling a Western outlet that she didn't disappear, she said she just had too many messages to respond to, that she herself deleted the accusation. But no inquiry has been announced, and there is still no way of knowing whether Peng has been allowed to speak her own mind.
CNN's Selena Wang reporting. Time now for a check of the papers with ABC News Radio's Carly Williams. Good morning, Carly. And the Parliament's formal apology to victims of alleged sexual assault and bullying in the building is happening today, but a key voice on this issue hasn't been invited.
Good morning. Brittany Higgins told News.com she hadn't been invited to the Parliament's historic formal apology to victims of alleged sexual harassment in the building. It's been almost 1 year since the former Liberal staffer went public with allegations she was raped in Parliament House in 2019. Brittany Higgins is in Canberra this week to deliver a major speech to the National Press Club. She told News.com she would have loved to have been there for this apology today, and it would have been a full circle moment for her. COVID restrictions was the reported reason behind the tight numbers at today's event, but after News.com reported on the issue last night, Parliament made sure there would be space for Ms Higgins.
The Daily Telegraph is celebrating the walls of so-called Fortress Australia coming down.
A full-page snap of New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet reaching his arms out wide. It's like a virtual hug on the cover of the Daily Telegraph. The Premier says he wants to welcome the world with open arms. The splash headline is G'day World, and of course this is all in reference to the big news Australia will open its borders to double-vaccinated international tourists on February 21. That is after 2 years of closure.
Yeah, the border reopening has been a huge story. We now have that date of February 21. What's been the reaction from overnight?
Well, the Sydney Morning Herald reports Australia might have a little bit of an image problem overseas because of our strict COVID rules, and they could have scared some tourists off. Tourism Australia CEO Philippa Harrison told the SMH that Australia has been a bit ridiculed around the world for its border closures, and we could struggle to regain our share of global tourism dollars. This isn't a hunch, this is based on recent market research. There's plenty of hope from the industry though. Qantas boss Alan Joyce says he's even considering expediting flights from more destinations and adding capacity to existing routes.
And Carly, a Sydney woman has had an unfortunate accident with a spider and a high heel. What can you tell us about that?
The overnight splash on Yahoo News is quite the yarn. Alyssa Lambert was trying to catch a rogue spider in her bedroom in her Sydney apartment, as you do this time of year. She jumped off her bed and straight onto one of her high-heeled shoes. She's ended up with 4.5 centimetres of her high heel impaled in her foot. The X-ray is extraordinary on Yahoo News. It's gone right through her foot. She needed surgery but is thankfully feeling better now and is reassessing her spider catching strategy for future.
No doubt, Carly. Thank you. ABC News Radio's Carly Williams joining us there. Let's turn to the sports desk now, and Jared Coots back. Jared, history was made at the Winter Olympics overnight.
Yeah, hello again to you, Ellie. It certainly was. Dutch speed skater Arjen Voost has become the first person to win individual gold medals at 5 Winter Olympics. Pretty incredible stuff. Voost has taken out the women's 1,500 metre event at the Beijing Winter Games in Olympic record time. Claimed her 6th gold medal since debuting in 2006. 35-year-old is now the third most successful Winter Olympian of all time with 12 medals overall. And the BBC's Nurse Ricky asked Dutch journalist Nick de Mol how the Netherlands is reacting to the record.
I just called some friends.
What do you think?
And even though most of the people are just working right now, millions of them watched the race, and yeah, it was a hot topic in business meetings as well. Also, the Prime Minister has openly congratulated her with this amazing win, and yeah, I think our whole country is happy for her and proud of her.
Just explain a bit more to us, because speed skating as a sport, it's almost part of Dutch people's DNA, isn't it? How much does Irene Wust really embody that?
She really embodies that, I think. The story behind that is actually really funny. Her dad took part in a very heroic natural ice. We call it the Elfstedentocht. It was some decades ago that happened. Wust was really young back then, and was there to support her father. And yeah, what did he do? He quit before he finished. And Wust couldn't believe why he did that, and she was very mad. And that was the first moment where she said, I'm going to do it different. So it all started there, and yeah, skating is just a popular part of most Dutch people's lives.
It seems odd to even say it now, but there were some questions, weren't there, over her selection for this Olympics, but clearly this gold medal vindicates that.
Yeah, the Dutch people are always very critical, even when you won 6 Olympic titles like Irene Wust. But I think, yeah, she deserves better than that, and today she showed again why.
So how surprising was the win for her today, this title? Because she wasn't the favourite, was she, heading into this race?
No, she wasn't, but I think there was only one Olympics where she was a favourite, and that was back in 2010 in Vancouver, Canada. And yeah, she just knows exactly how to be the best version of herself when the pressure is at the highest, and that's what makes her such an exceptional athlete.
So what do you think is next for her? She says she's going to retire next month. What do you think that the future holds for Irene?
Actually, she just announced here in Beijing that she wants to become a mother, and that will be her first priority. And besides that, she told me before that she wants to fulfill a mental role in sports, but she doesn't know yet exactly what she's going to do. But if I were a talented athlete, I would think there's no better mentor than her.
The Dutch journalist Nick Tell there speaking to the BBC's Mas Faruqi. And as for Irene Wüst, who picked up that record, Ali, she is now retiring at the end of the game, so what a way to go out.
What a way, Jared Coote, thank you. Let's take a look at finance now, and Wall Street is trading higher at the moment. The Dow Jones is up by 0.5%, 35,266. The S&P 500 up by 0.3% to 4,515. The Nasdaq also higher now, up by 0.3% to 14,143. One Australian dollar is buying 71.27 US cents, 52 British pence, 62 euro cents, 82 Japanese yen, and $1.07 New Zealand. And taking a look at the weather for the capital cities now. In Brisbane, a mostly sunny day, heading for a top of 30 degrees. Currently it's 18. Sydney, a shower or two clearing with 25 the maximum, 16 degrees right now. Canberra, a possible shower, a high of 24, right now it's 10. Melbourne, fine and sunny, heading for a top of 31, currently sitting on 16. Hobart becoming cloudy with 23 the forecast high. It's 16 at the moment. Adelaide, afternoon showers, a top of 34. Currently it's 25. Perth, a mostly sunny day with 26 the forecast high. It's 14 at the moment. And in Darwin, showers and a possible storm at a high of 31. Currently it's 27 degrees. It's 7 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, 6:30 in South Australia, 6 o'clock in Queensland, 5:30 in the NT, and 4 o'clock in the West.
Vice President Mike Pence.
Good morning, Helen Zaremus with ABC News. The first batch of the Novavax COVID vaccine has now arrived in Australia. Alison Shah reports.
The first shipment of the Novavax COVID vaccine arrived in Sydney last night with about 3 million doses on board the flight from Singapore. It's the first arrival of 51 million doses of the vaccine purchased by Australian authorities. They'll be batch tested first and available from the 21st of February at GPs, pharmacies and state hubs across the country. The vaccine regulator approved use of the vaccine for people aged 18 and over last month. It's the fourth COVID vaccine available in Australia.
Experts have confirmed the Northern Territory has the highest COVID hospitalisation rate in the country. More from Miles Holbrook-Walk.
There's currently 156 people in hospital with COVID across the NT, the highest of any jurisdiction per capita. The peak on a per capita basis is far higher than it was in New South Wales. Professor of Infectious Diseases at Griffith University, Nigel McMillan, says the worst of it may be yet to come.
If we look at the Queensland data, so peak was on the 17th for cases and peak for hospitalisations on the 25th. So generally 7 to 10 days after cases, you'll see hospitalisations.
There's currently 29 people on oxygen and 3 in intensive care.
There are calls for Queensland's check-in app to be repurposed to make it more relevant to the current stage of the pandemic. More from Elizabeth Cramsey.
Queensland is believed to have passed the peak of the Omicron wave, with people no longer required to check in at venues where there are no vaccine requirements, like supermarkets, gyms and taxis. Infectious diseases expert Dr. Nigel McMillan from Griffith University says the app has little use when the health department is no longer using the information to trace cases, but he says it could be repurposed to provide helpful information.
Where can you buy kits, PCR testing locations,
restrictions, what to do if you're a close contact, travel.
The check-in app still needs to be used at pubs, clubs, cafes and restaurants.
Tasmania's government says schools will be able to maintain core learning activities even if 20% of staff and students are absent because of COVID. Laura Beavis reports.
Tasmanian state school students start classes tomorrow. Acting Education Minister Jeremy Rockcliffe says the Education Department has undertaken internal modelling to assess the effect of a range of COVID scenarios and develop management strategies. He says the assessment indicated a 5% absence rate would have a minimal impact on schools. If absence rates reached 20%, the impact would be significant, but it could be managed and core learning maintained. Labor is demanding the government release the full details of the workforce modelling.
A report by Deloitte Access Economics says South Australia's economy had the second fastest growth rate in the country last year. Chris McLaughlin reports.
The report says the state's economy grew by an estimated 7% in 2021. The growth was attributed to effective control of the Delta variant, which meant consumers could go shopping freely, with personal spending up by 4.2% year on year. The report says living with the Omicron variant could see people avoid retail and hospitality outlets, with state consumption forecast to drop by 3.5% in 2022. Housing construction was up 11% in 2021, the strongest growth since the early 2000s. In another strong performance, grain exports were up 88%, but South Australia's wine industry is still feeling the effects of China's wine tariffs.
The federal government is struggling to find a consensus on how wide-ranging protections for religious freedom should be. Parliament resumes today, and the federal government's nominated passing the laws as a priority. But some Liberals are worried the proposed law will permit discrimination on other grounds, such as sexuality or gender. Liberal MP Katie Allen says it's difficult to strike the right balance.
Where it lands is still anyone's guess at this point in time, because there are a lot of competing and conflicting interests, and there's a lot of concerns about unintended consequences.
The Commonwealth Parliament will offer a statement of acknowledgement of harassment, bullying and sexual assault that's happened at Parliament. It'll be delivered in both the House of Representatives and the Senate today. The acknowledgement was the first recommendation of the Jenkins Review into parliamentary workplace practices. The federal government will also introduce legislation on other recommendations. ABC News. The New South Wales opposition says pork barrelling is now endemic inside the state government. Labor says 75% of club grants were distributed to projects in state government electorates. The grants for community, sport or health infrastructure are from club gaming machine profits in New South Wales. Labor leader Chris Minns says the New South Wales government's repeatedly directed taxpayer money to its own seats at the expense of other communities.
Much of this money has been collected from communities in Sydney southwest from gambling revenue. Virtually none of the money is going back into those communities. Now, this is another example, whether it's the Stronger Communities Fund, the Merged Council Fund, the Sports Grants Fund, that happens again and again and again.
An elite soldier will face a second day of cross-examination at the defamation trial of war veteran Ben Roberts-Smith today, after admitting he's previously been professionally reprimanded. The SAS operator claims to have seen Mr. Roberts-Smith order the execution of an Afghan man during a mission in 2012, but Mr. Roberts-Smith denies that. Yesterday, the witness admitted he was once disciplined after his estranged wife took a hard drive containing deployment photographs from his home. He told the federal court she tried to blackmail him for $50,000 by threatening to hand them to the media. An Australian-Chinese dual citizen is being prosecuted under Hong Kong's sweeping national security law. Stephen Jedgetts has more.
The department said last year that an Australian had been detained in Hong Kong, but now it's provided fresh details about the case. It's revealed he was arrested in January last year. The ABC's also been told he's been detained for lengthy periods since then. Australian officials have been repeatedly refused consular access to the man because Hong Kong authorities no longer recognise dual citizenship. The department has not said what charges he's facing, but the national security law gives the authorities broad powers to impose heavy penalties, including life imprisonment, for vaguely worded crimes such as subversion.
Cambodia's Prime Minister has apologised after wrongly saying an Australian economist detained for almost a year in Myanmar had been released. His Southeast Asia correspondent Mazoe Ford.
When Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen met with Myanmar's junta chief last month, he raised the topic of Sean Turnell's detention on behalf of the Australian government. During a speech in Cambodia on Monday, Hun Sen announced the Sydney professor had been released. Within hours, a junta spokesperson said that wasn't true, but added that General Min Aung Hlaing would think about it once Professor Turnell's legal proceedings were complete. The Economist was working in Myanmar as an advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi before they were both arrested when the military seized power.
World leaders are ramping up talks with Ukraine and Russia as NATO considers sending more troops to the region because of growing invasion fears. Europe correspondent Isabella Higgins.
French President Emmanuel Macron is meeting with his Russian counterpart in Moscow. He is one of the top Western leaders to visit the country since it amassed thousands of troops on Ukraine's border. He says war should be avoided at all costs. Vladimir Putin says Russia shares security goals with France, but reiterated that he feels the West is ignoring his country's security demands. NATO says it's considering bolstering its troops in the region, while US officials say their intelligence shows there is a real prospect of a Russian invasion.
Now with sport, Jack Snape.
Australian cricketer Alyssa Healy says her team has demonstrated resilience this summer ahead of the final Women's Ashes one-dayer in Melbourne today. The home side has already secured the series, but England presented a major obstacle. Healy says the players are now looking ahead to the World Cup in New Zealand next month.
The fact that we're able to fight scrap and work our way back into fixtures or win games, with our backs against the wall has been really impressive, and I think leading into a really big World Cup is hugely important.
Australian speed skater Brendan Corey has crashed out of his 1,000 metre short track quarter-final at the Beijing Winter Olympics. Corey was penalised for taking out two skaters on the final corner, including eventual gold medalist Ren Jai Wei. The Australian had been sitting in third place and was looking to move up, but caught his lead skate on Ren, sending all three into the barriers. And Australian tennis player Alex de Minaur has won his first round match in Rotterdam 6-love, 6-3 over Belgian David Goffin.
To finance, stocks have shifted between small gains and losses in afternoon trading on Wall Street. The S&P 500 up 0.33%, the Dow Jones 0.5% higher, and the Nasdaq's up 0.25%. The Aussie share market expected to open modestly higher this morning. And the dollar is up. It's now buying 71.2 US cents. ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
Good morning, I'm Ali Crew. Great to have your company on this Tuesday, the 8th of February. Coming up.
So good to hear. Yeah, welcome relief and something we've been preparing for, but we can't, press the green button until we head that. So absolutely delighted.
Australia prepares to welcome back vaccinated international travellers later this month after a 2-year ban. And Queenslanders no longer have to check into supermarkets, gyms and retail stores. All the details just ahead.
The essence of China-US economic and trade relations is achieving mutual
Almost 2
benefit
years
and
after the
win-win
government
results.
closed Australia to the
And there are
world,
no
tourism
winners from the
operators are
trade
preparing for the international border to reopen to fully vaccinated travellers. The new border rules will come into effect on the 21st of February. The news has been welcomed by the tourism industry, which has been crying out for movement on the border closure. Stephanie Ferrier reports from Melbourne Airport.
This is a very exciting announcement for those fully vaccinated tourists. So the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was quite clear about the fact that everybody had to abide by the rules. And at the moment, for the most part, that means people who have had 2 doses, barring that 1 dose Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and they won't need their booster to be able to come in. However, we have obviously heard from ATAGI that they're considering at the moment whether or not to change that definition from fully vaccinated to up-to-date vaccinations like childhood vaccinations, so that issue might change later. But in the meantime, for people who are unvaccinated, who are tourists who want to come in, well, they will have to apply to get a special exemption to be able to enter Australia.
Monday's comments
They'll
come a
also
day
have
before
to
the US
undergo hotel
government is due to
quarantine, and they'll be
release full-year
subject
trade
to
data
state
that
arrivals
analysts
caps
expect
as
to
well.
show a significant
But this
shortfall
is a
in
really
China's
important
pledge to increase
announcement. It
purchases
is
of US farm
703
and
days
manufactured goods,
on
energy
February the
and
21st
services.
since we saw the drawbridge here in Australia go up. And so we are looking forward to really welcoming a lot more of those foreign tourists to be able to come in.
Australia is using tech to fight against deforestation and global warming. Decreasing carbon dioxide in atmosphere is key in the battle to tackle climate change.
For that
the main
very,
obstacle
very
in that fight is how to plant new trees in a short time in areas that are hard to access.
That they were just
biotech company Airseed in Australia is now experimenting with drones to help speed up the process.
However, others are
Engineers
saying
and
that it is
biologists
important
collaborated
to notice
create
that it's
a new
not just
drone,
like turning
organic
on a
crop.
tap.
This
It is
drone
going
then
to
allows
take
them to
time
plant
to
trees in a
start to
fraction
ramp
of the
up
time
those flights
the process
as well,
normally
and make
takes.
sure that people know that Australia is back in business. So they're really calling for a big marketing campaign out there as well. And when you look at the change, we had before the change, before we actually had the borders closed, we were having around 1 million or so tourists coming in every month, and that dropped dramatically in April 2020 down to around only 6,500. So there is just so far to still be able to go. And we've also heard from the cruise industry as well, saying that they're disappointed that they're not included in this announcement to be able to restart their operations here in
These
Australia.
specially designed pods then provide protection and nourishment to the seeds. During the crucial growth stage, the drones then help spread the pods in a larger area in a faster and more cost-effective manner as it cuts down on labour costs. The aim of the project is to allow for biodiversity.
No longer have to have the check-in apps
we're able
as
to
part of the
tackle some of the species that are hard to do hand planting with, which is the less traditional form of restoration.
Long-term recovery that's needed for
we're able
businesses
to
like
access
that.
areas that
It's
are really hard
supermarkets
to
really is
walk
the big
on
one
or
that you don't have to go and check in anymore, but it's also shops and taxis and gyms, places like that. And yeah, like I said, just allow those businesses just to really think and have a clear path forward from this point onwards. But it's different for pubs, clubs, cafes and restaurants. They still need people to use the check-in app and to show their vaccination status. And the Chamber of Commerce would like to see a little bit more clarity around the future of that, because it was promised that once we got to 90% double doses, that would all be reviewed, and we're currently sitting at 89.97% double dose, so we're 0.03 away from that, so edging closer to it. And they would just like some certainty around it, those businesses, so they can start really thinking about planning for their long-term recovery.
What do the experts say about the state relaxing the use of the check-in app?
Yeah, we've heard from one expert, Dr. Nigel McMillan from the Griffith University. He says, look, that this is a good move because the check-in app, it hasn't been used for what it was originally intended for some time, which of course with the contact tracing now, we've got thousands of cases every day in the state. He says it still is useful for showing someone's vaccination status, and it could even be repurposed, so you could use it for, say, finding rapid antigen tests, for finding where to get a PCR test done, and other things like that. You know, what should you do if you've been a close contact, and you could actually put all that information on that check-in app, and it could be used for other purposes, so not scrapped altogether.
Warming. Scientists say that reforestation combined with other technologies
World leaders are engaging in a round of shuttle diplomacy to head off a possible Russian invasion of
Airseed is
Ukraine.
currently active
The French
in the
president's flown to
populated
Moscow,
states of
while the new
Australia.
German
It
leaders
is
gone
expected
to
to
the White
expand
House amid talk
operations
that
to
NATO is
Europe and
considering
Southeast
further
Asia
bolstering
to
its troops
assist
in
in
the region.
reforestation
Your correspondent
in
Isabella
these
Higgins
regions.
France's Emmanuel Macron is on a diplomatic mission in Moscow.
How are you? Fine, just fine. How are you? Do you have good trip?
He arrived for talks at the Kremlin with Vladimir Putin, one of the top Western leaders to visit the country since it amassed more than 100,000 troops on the border of Ukraine. Emmanuel Macron says war should be avoided at all costs.
Et je pense que la discussion d'aujourd'hui, à mes yeux,
I think today's discussion can start to show the direction we need to go in, a de-escalation, the terms of which we already know.
Vladimir Putin took a friendly tone, thanking his French counterpart for considering his security concerns.
I understand that we have a common concern about what's happening in the security area in Europe.
I want to thank you for the fact that France actively takes part in finding principled solutions to the problem.
Russia is calling for Ukraine to be blocked from joining the military alliance NATO. This demand Western leaders say is unreasonable but have offered to continue talks. Here's NATO Military Committee Chair Rob Bauer discussing Russia's military build-up.
If you're really considering an invasion, you actually need more than a fighting force. And that is something we also see now more and more being gathered along both the borders of Russia with Ukraine and Belarus with Ukraine.
The UK has announced they're sending 350 additional troops to Poland. NATO's Rob Bauer says it's also considering more deployments in the region.
NATO is constantly looking at the debate about that.
The US sent 3,000 troops to Romania and Poland last week. President Joe Biden is using a meeting with Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz to encourage the country to take stronger action. They're discussing sanctions and the Nord Stream 2.0 gas pipeline between Russia and Germany. Joe Biden says it should not progress if the country invades.
Now the latest numbers are a big jump on a year before, when the firm was hit by production shutdowns as a result of the global health crisis. The return of Marvel superhero movies last year was another key source of earnings for the consumer products unit. Revenue there was up 9% in Q4 on demand for toys based on film characters. Looking ahead, the company expects 2022 revenue to rise at a low single-digit rate.
Ending that report by our Europe correspondent Isabella Higgins. In Ukraine's eastern region of Dnipro,
وحدث برضو مستديمة أو إبعاد عن العمل 21 يوم ويكون هناك تربص بأسلحة واستعانة بزويل وأشخاص آخرين لا يقل عن 3 سنوات ولا يزيد عن 5 سنوات وغرامة 5000 جنيه.
Casualties slowed right down after a ceasefire several years ago. Riots fury followed years, while rumors that the conflict is about to erupt again.
Make sure that we cannot achieve anything. It's a real risk. Make sure that the country is unfocused. Come back into office.
Hi, I'm Femi OK. You're watching The Stream. In the United States, the cases of black women who go missing rarely make their headlines. So, our question today is not why does that happen? We all know why that happens, but what can be done about it? In recent years, communities, families have been involved with somebody who's been loved, who's gone missing or even murdered. They have rallied around to protect black women. Let me give you one example. It's an HBO documentary called Black and
The detective kept saying, she ran away. And I'm like, she didn't run away. It was like a punch in the face.
When a black person is in distress, missing, it's not a big deal to law enforcement because they don't think we have much to lose.
This one always gets me just remembering when she was a little girl. Blame yourself because it's never done.
My sister went missing in 2009. From all the major news stations, nobody would talk to me.
Gwen Ifill coined the term missing white woman syndrome. If those criteria, blonde hair, blue eyes, your stories are not newsworthy.
Here's my niece. She's missing. Her story is just as compelling.
We have nothing for our missing people except black folks' spit and grit.
Helping us share this story with you, this issue with you on the screen. Alex, Aisha, Amara, thank you so much for being part of our program. Alex, please introduce yourself to our global audience and who you are and what you do.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Alexandra, the Director of Political Advocacy at Black Boston, a community organization, and a doctoral student at Suffolk University studying youth development.
Good to have you. Aisha, I want you to introduce yourself to our streaming audience, but also tell them your connection with this particular issue. Black women going missing, not being reported enough.
My name is Aisha Miller, and September 11th, 1986, my mother was kidnapped and murdered, as well as my oldest sister, who was 18 years old at the time. And for 21 years, we didn't know what happened to them. And it wasn't until the cold case detectives worked that case in 2007, 2008, where they found him and he was already in prison for having done the same thing to another young lady just 2 months after. He kidnapped and murdered my mother and sister. So now, what I do is host a show that reflects and focuses on the effects of childhood trauma on adult behavior.
Aisha, thank you so much, and I really appreciate you being on today's show, bringing your personal experience and sharing it with us in our show. I'm going to bring in Amara. Amara, thanks for being on this stream. Again, please introduce yourself to our audience. Tell them who you are and what you do.
Cross-country skiers are in action in the men's and women's sprint free.
My name is Amara Gopher, and I am the creator, host, and executive producer for Black Girl Gone, a true crime podcast.
Thank you so much. All right, so we have 3 guests who are able to answer your questions, really dig into this topic. It's a hard conversation to have, but if you're on YouTube right now, your comments, your questions, I welcome you. You can be part of the discussion. Alex, let's start. Alex, Amara, Aisha, let's start with giving our international audience an idea of what it is like when you see coverage of, if you see coverage of black women who've gone missing, or maybe something tragic has happened to them. Just in a nutshell, Alex, can you help our international audience understand what it is like?
What I can say, when a black woman or girl is gone missing, there is not equitable coverage. And I think a lot of people understand white woman missing syndrome, which was coined by African American journalist Gwen Ifill back in 2004. And this was basically aligning with that same sentiment, is that when black women and girls are missing, there is a lack of urgency, but when it's someone that is white, or in other words, or not in other words, but what people will say is conventionally attractive white women, that all of the image is improved. And when people view that, it's like this person is being soft. So it really goes back to the depictions of black womanhood and black girls. How society has trained our mind to think about black women.
With cancer. Perot's second run through
and I think that reflects on how our law enforcement treats black girls. we've been trained to view them in a certain way. So there is not equitable coverage, and I think that's one of the reasons why, is because there's a lack of protection. We are seen as, you know, we're not valuable to
There was
society.
one game in the NBL last night. Who won?
I see you nodding, Amara. Articulate that, no, go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. It's one of the reasons why I started my show. We all know that there is a lack of coverage of these stories, but there's a lack of concern, and, you know, one of the excuses that, you know, people often make is that when they elevate the stories of missing white women like Gabby Petito, one of the things that I heard over and over again was that she was so relatable, and that they could see themselves in her, and they could see their daughters in her, or their friends in her, and they don't see that when black women are missing, and that's a problem. And it's the way in which their stories are covered. It's the way in which we don't get into their lives. We don't find out who they are. And so, you know, how could someone connect to them if we don't know these women? So, you know, that's why I wanted to do a show that focuses more on telling who these women were, so that you can eliminate the excuse of, well, I can't relate to that, or, you know, we can all relate to each other, even if it's just that we are women, you know what I mean? Like, we all have different struggles, we all come from different places, but some of our struggles are the same, and we can relate to each other, you know, in a way that makes these stories more real for people, and more, you know, something that they care about.
Now, stocks have shifted between small gains and losses in afternoon trading on Wall Street.
Gabby Petito was a young white woman who eventually was found to have been strangled. That story was on cable news almost every night. It was like a running, tragic soap opera. Aisha, what do you want to add?
My question is, do we hear about it? Do we actually hear about it? You know, it comes on, but it's a blip in the news. It comes on maybe one news cycle, one or two. I know at least for my family,
clearing and 25 the forecast high at 16 at the moment.
that was about it. And until we started raising our voices and going to the police more often, we wrote to everybody, every news outlet, and not just news outlet, television programs, major networks that were on at that time, and nobody paid attention. No one gave us any credibility. So what I know and understand is that nobody listens. Well, very few people listen. I would say no one.
Federal MP
But
Zali Steggall
now,
says today marks
I'm
an
grateful
important
that we
first
have
step
more
toward
opportunities
reforming
to
the
do that,
culture
such as
inside
the
Parliament
different
House.
platforms,
The Commonwealth Parliament
such
will
as
offer a
Ms.
statement
Black
acknowledging
Girl
past
Gone
harassment, bullying and
we're
sexual
able to
assault
bring
that's
a
happened
voice
there.
and bring the
The
voices
acknowledgement was the
alive.
first recommendation of
And
the Jenkins
let them know that we
review, launched
are
after former
human.
staffer Brittany Higgins
Just
went
like
public
my
with
mom,
her
even
allegations
today,
she
this
was
is
raped.
35 years, this
A
is
union
taking me
representing
35
aged care
years
workers says it's wary
even
of the
talk
plan to
about
deploy defence
to
forces
the
into
degree
nursing homes.
that it needs
The
to
federal
be
government will
talked
make up to
about for me
1,700
because it's
personnel
so
available
personal.
to help
It
stabilise
was
COVID
so
outbreaks and
hurtful.
ease staff shortages.
I mean, I
The
can't-
groups of resisting the move.
So Aisha, you sent us this picture, you sent us several pictures. One is you are the spitting image of your mum. Okay, so everyone, this is Aisha's mum. This is little, I'm going to say baby girl, but you were about 9 at the time. This is you, Aisha, and you lost your mum and your sister in a tragic situation, and you had about a week's worth of attention from the media, and that was it. Why did they move on? Why didn't they stay with this story?
Wide-ranging protections for religious freedoms should be.
At that time, they wanted to accuse my father because generally in a domestic case, they want to finish on the relative, somebody that they knew. So it went unnoticed.
Club grants were distributed to
because they
projects in state government
couldn't connect him to it. They had no DNA wasn't that popular back in 1986, but they couldn't pin him, and so they couldn't.
The Clean Energy Regulator says more than 360,000 systems were installed across the country.
So,
back to you, Alan.
It just went cold.
Thank you.
The case went cold, and unfortunately,
February 7th,
he did the same thing to another young lady just 2 months after that. She lived, and because she lived,
Canada's capital
she's the reason why
indefinitely
we
the
know
city declares a state of emergency.
And it took that long. But even her, nobody paid attention to her.
Also take a look at what Australia's
Senator, just to kind of tag
could
in.
mean for the local economy.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to kind of tag in what on Aisha's point about the, reaching out to media outlets and them just not caring. That is such a common thing I see in the stories that I tell of these families, particularly of the missing women, reaching out to the local media and them just kind of just like, this is really not that interesting of a story for us.
By truck drivers is threatening the safety and security of residents. The protest began after a COVID vaccine mandate was introduced, forcing drivers to be vaccinated to cross the US border or face testing and quarantine arrangements. A similar vaccine mandate is in place for the US land border. The protest has gathered wider support, as Deutsche Welle's Minka Kerr reports.
Making themselves heard in Canada's capital, these protesters have paralysed central Ottawa, and the city's mayor has declared a state of emergency. The so-called Freedom Convoy started as a protest by truckers at a new COVID-19 vaccine mandate for crossing the border from the US, but it's grown into a rallying point against pandemic restrictions and the government.
People should be able to make their own choice to take the needle or not take the needle and not lose the job, not lose their house, not lose their income just for the vaccination.
Ottawa's mayor said the situation on the streets was out of control as demonstrators outnumbered police. There are reports of protesters displaying Confederate and Nazi symbols. But the movement has gained international support and millions of dollars in donations through its GoFundMe page. The crowdfunding site has now removed the page and said it will refund all donations. Many Ottawa residents have said members of the Freedom Convoy have harassed them and complained of non-stop horn blaring. Some have staged counter-protests.
I just have to stand up. I was born just after the Second World War, and I heard what it is like not to be free, and they are saying freedom, they are free. They don't know what it is not to be free.
About 90% of cross-border truckers and almost 80% of Canada's population are fully vaccinated. But this loud minority say they're staying put until COVID-19 restrictions are lifted.
That report from Deutsche Welle's Minka Kerr. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is still feeling the effects of the resignations of 5 aides last week. Some senior roles have been filled, but Downing Street says further personnel changes will be announced in the coming days. Mr Johnson has faced growing anger over parties held in Downing Street during COVID lockdowns and questions about his chaotic style of leadership. And the PM is still facing the threat of a leadership challenge from within the Conservative Party. CNN's Bianca Nobilo reports from London.
So we have two significant roles being filled in recent days. The Director of Communications to be filled by Guto Harry, who actually I interviewed not long ago. And he is a bit of a departure from the usual Director of Communications because he's already waded into the fray. You know the adage goes that you shouldn't become the story if you're the Director of Communications, but he hasn't held back. He's been very critical of the Prime Minister's ex-right-hand man, Dominic Cummings, and he's already made statements to the media, and one of which, speaking to a Welsh media outlet, he recounted a story of when he approached the Prime Minister once he'd been invited to Downing Street a few days ago, and that Boris Johnson broke into a rendition of Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive when greeted with his former advisor Guto Harry, and that they had a little sing-song together before they shook hands and started working together in this new role. So he's already proven to be quite colourful and a lot more willing to speak to the media than others that we've had in the past. Joining the Prime Minister as Chief of Staff, we have Stephen Barclay. Now this is an unusual appointment, Hala, because Stephen Barclay is an MP. He's also a Cabinet Minister. He's also Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, which sounds a bit esoteric, but it's actually a massive job that oversees everything from COVID-19 policy, national security, and plenty of other matters of coordination. Now the fact that the Prime Minister is picking someone with many other jobs to become Chief of Staff does suggest that he's had quite a difficult time recruiting and that people aren't exactly beating the door down to join his team. However, Barclay is considered to be a safe pair of hands and obviously somebody who understands the discontent that's rife in the Prime Minister's backbenches at the moment.
And what about Carrie Johnson, the spouse, the Prime Minister's spouse? She issued a statement over the weekend. What did it say?
She did. So she issued a statement through her spokeswoman in response largely to a book being written by the Tory peer Lord Ashcroft called First Lady, I believe, which is being serialised at the moment in the British newspaper The Daily Mail. And her spokeswoman said it was the latest in a brutal briefing campaign against Carrie Johnson and just the latest attempt to discredit her by bitter ex-officials. Now this is not entirely new. Carrie Johnson is in something of a unique position. She is obviously a lot younger than the Prime Minister, and she is somebody who styled herself prior to living in Downing Street and being the Prime Minister's spouse as a political and environmental activist. She also used to work for the Conservative Party in a sort of media advisory role. So this is somebody who does have a lot of political knowledge and have a lot of ambition in that space, but she is basically pushing back against any allegations that she's having undue influence or should be blamed for playing a part in any of these scandals such as Partygate or other things that the Prime Minister has been blamed for. So they're trying to quash all of those discussions. But it has been unusual in some respects. It is strange for a Prime Minister, historically speaking, to be married and to have a baby when he is in office in Downing Street. So she has been perhaps more at the forefront than the average spouse in Number 10.
CNN's Bianca Nobilo speaking to Hala Garani. Meanwhile, the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has been mobbed by protesters outside Parliament House, with police being forced to intervene and escort him to his car. Some of the protesters were chanting about notorious sex offender Jimmy Savile. Last week, Boris Johnson accused Sir Keir of failing to prosecute Savile when he was the former Director of Public Prosecutions. This comment led to a number of Mr Johnson's staff members to resign. Returning home, and several houses and over 60,000 hectares of bush have been burned as a result of 4 destructive bushfires that have swept through Western Australia's south. The state's DFES chief says the changing climate made the fires more intense. At last year's COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, Australia was the only major developed country that refused to set a stronger 2030 emissions target. Meanwhile, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says he wants the G7 nations, including the UK and the US, to become founding members of an international carbon club. This alliance of countries would coordinate shared climate policy standards and impose costs on countries that don't meet them. Dr. Wesley Morgan is a research fellow at Griffith University. He's also a researcher with the Climate Council, and he joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
Leslie, can you tell us, where did the idea for a climate alliance come from?
Well, the idea was actually developed by a Nobel Prize-winning economist called William Nordhaus. And Nordhaus proposed this as a way of overcoming the problem of free riding, which is where countries avoid doing their share to tackle climate change, even while they benefit from the actions of other nations who are moving first to cut their emissions and switch to cleaner technologies. And so Nordhaus proposed a climate club that would stop countries from free riding like this by rewarding countries who move first and protecting them from competitive disadvantage. And the idea is that countries that don't meet their global obligations to cut emissions would incur real economic penalties, like a carbon tariff on their exports to the members of this climate alliance.
How would it work exactly, though? How would it potentially be rolled out?
Well, the new German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, is really taken by this idea that's been proposed by Nordhaus. And this year, Germany is president of the G7 group of countries, which is a grouping of the world's wealthiest democracies. So Germany wants to turn the G7 into a climate club. And Scholz has proposed that the G7 countries develop a shared minimum carbon price, and that they consider tariffs on goods into their markets from other countries that don't have a carbon price or meaningful climate policy at home. The EU already does this. The EU has an internal carbon market and will next year start imposing border tariffs on imported goods based on the emissions generated in their production. So this kind of thing is already starting to happen and is intended to promote clean industry. And Germany is suggesting that G7 countries could negotiate similar arrangements.
So could this spell bad news for Australia?
Well, I think it should be ringing alarm bells in Canberra, because Australia is regarded internationally as a free rider in global climate efforts, because Australia really has no meaningful federal climate policy. At last year's COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, for example, Australia was the only developed country that didn't set a stronger 2030 emissions target. So while these other developed countries are taking action, Australia is standing still. So our key allies like the UK, like the US, they're planning to cut their emissions in half this decade. And the G7 countries as a group, they're planning to cut their emissions by at least 50% by 2030. But we in Australia are only planning to cut emissions by 26 to 28%. So we're well behind, and if the G7 does form a climate club, we're unlikely to be invited to join. And that could have real costs. We could see border tariffs on Australian exports, but also we could lose investment capital and the investment, the economic gains that would come from us being a first mover towards clean industries.
There have already been some moves to set shared climate standards across the Atlantic off the back of COP26. What are other countries doing?
Well, we saw examples of this last year. So at the time of COP26, the European Union and the US, they announced they're going to negotiate a deal to restrict access to their markets for high carbon steel and aluminium. So they're going to cut tariffs to each other, and they're going to impose penalties on steel that is made with higher emissions. And this is probably aimed at countries like China, but it was the first deal of its kind, and it shows the kind of cooperation we're going to increasingly see amongst the big powers as they integrate climate goals into their trade policy.
What are the potential downsides of such an alliance?
Well, some people do worry that a climate alliance amongst rich countries could undermine broader cooperation at the UN. So it's important that any proposed climate club actually complements and strengthens cooperation under the Paris Agreement, for example. It would have to be designed well.
All right, Wesley, well, it's great to get your insights and analysis of this. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's Dr. Wesley Morgan, a Research Fellow at Griffith University. This is ABC News Radio. I'm Ali Crew. Also making news today, Australian troops could be sent into aged care homes within days to ease severe staff shortages in the sector. Up to 1,700 Defence staff may be asked to support the struggling workforce. Specialist teams will be deployed in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia after completing training on the weekend. And after almost 2 years, the government closed Australia to the world. Tourism operators are preparing for the international border to reopen to fully vaccinated travellers. The new border rules will come into effect on the 21st of February. The news has been welcomed by the tourism industry, which has been crying out for movement on the border closure. Now, with Australia's international borders opening for the first double vaccinated much sooner than expected, there's now the challenge of bringing life back to deserted offices and CBDs. While travel stocks soared on the news, business groups say it will take months or even a year to breathe life back into local economies. For more, we're joined by the ABC senior business correspondent Peter Ryan. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Ali.
The travel sector was caught by surprise by the early opening news. How did investors react yesterday?
Well, Ali, there was a lot of action on the Australian share market yesterday afternoon. The travel and tourism sector, of course, has been smashed by the lockdowns and border restrictions. But the outlook for foreign tourists returning from February the 21st is now a big boost to confidence, but also for international students who might start returning is a major development for universities, which have collectively lost billions of dollars in revenue during the pandemic. So Qantas shares rose around 4.5% yesterday afternoon. Flight Centre almost 8%. Regional Express up a massive 14%. Corporate Travel Management and Webjet, those travel agencies, up around 7%, with the hope of more people coming into the country and some people heading out. Of course, much of this is reliant on the strategy of easing restrictions continuing, and that Omicron eases and that there's no new variant. Locally, a big factor is Western Australia and uncertainty on when its borders will open. Qantas has already acted a few months ago by running its London flights via Darwin instead of Perth.
What does the decision to open international borders mean to CBDs, which we know have been badly hit by the restrictions and many people working from home?
Well, Ali, it's all of those associated businesses that rely on tourists and also workers being in town, whether that's a coffee shop, or a department store, a restaurant, a cinema. For example, the Harbour Bridge climb in Sydney, there are normally tourists constantly walking over the top of the coat hanger, and now it's just a trickle with no tourists. Just out this morning, we have the Commonwealth Bank's household spending intentions, and that's showing that spending was down a massive 21% in January. The entertainment index declined also by 21%, no one going out to movies, for example. Household services down 14%. All of this mainly driven by Omicron and people staying away. It's also a big problem for major employers like banks, which have huge office space in the CBDs. Much of this has been empty apart from essential workers, but now work is underway to get people back into the office amid concerns that without all those workers in CBDs, we're having ghost towns. Westpac's chief executive, Peter King, says this is going to be a very slow process, especially with so many staff now conditioned to working at home.
Our approach is going to be a hybrid approach. approach. So we expect people will spend time in the corporate buildings but also working flexibly from where they choose to work. We are targeting the 1st of March for more people to come back into our head offices, but I'm also aware that people are managing the risk of COVID in different ways, so that will be a gradual process, I think, over time. And we're just going to have to find ways, I think, to work to have more activity in the central business districts to bring people back. But if you do go for a walk around, there's not a lot of people at the moment around.
That's Westpac Chief Executive Peter King. And in the background, Peter, business groups are looking towards the federal budget for continued pandemic relief. Just what do they want to see exactly?
Well, we've seen a pre-budget submission from the Australian Industry Group out this morning, which represents the manufacturing industry. They want the federal government to commit to continued assistance to struggling businesses through future waves of COVID-19. That submission wants additional tax breaks and incentives that were introduced during the pandemic maintained. Also, they want the federal government to remain ready to offer targeted support to hard-hit businesses and households as new disruptions inevitably arise. Now, the federal budget is released on March the 29th. It's unlikely to be an austerity budget given the fragility of the economy and an election coming up, but signs of better times ahead, such as the jobless rate possibly falling below 4%, wages growth maybe even starting to tick up, could see official interest rates rise this year, and that could be a complication. But already, as we're hearing, strong economic management during the pandemic is a constant theme as the unofficial election campaign continues.
And Peter, while we have you, what can we expect on the local share market today?
Well, Ali, we're seeing the Australian share market opening perhaps 0.15% higher later on this morning, so pretty flat, as they say. Wall Street stocks are up slightly, despite mixed quarterly results from big technology companies. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is heading towards closing around about a third of 1% higher. Oil up $92.57 US a barrel, a big sign of inflation around the world, and the Australian dollar a little higher at the moment, 71.3 US cents.
Peter Ryan, thank you.
Thanks, Ali.
The ABC's senior business correspondent, Peter Ryan, joining us there.
ABC News Radio. News you can rely on.
We should be getting more people back faster than the current rate.
A statement made to authorities.
I am very disappointed. This is a false dichotomy.
The latest news bulletins. Up-to-the-minute coverage. Listen back to feature interviews.
What is it about this program that you believe will make it effective?
How would you rate the outcomes of this program? Are we looking at a potential success?
Anytime you like, throughout the day or night, you can stay informed with the latest developments.
With ABC News Radio.
Now it's time for more sports news with Jared Coote. Good morning, Jared.
Morning to you, Ali. How you doing?
Well, thank you. Now, what's the latest with Peng Shuai, the Chinese tennis player?
Yeah, so there's been some developments overnight. Peng has told French newspaper L'Equipe there's been a huge misunderstanding over a post in which she claimed she was forced into having sexual relations with a former Chinese party leader. Now, that post was quickly deleted, and Peng was absent from public life for several weeks in its wake, and she says now that she never alleged she suffered a sexual assault. Critics have highlighted that L'Equipe had to submit questions in advance, with a representative from China's Olympic Committee translating Peng's comments from Mandarin. The BBC's Maz Faruqi spoke to sports reporter Alex Capstick about her latest interview.
L'Equipe approached the Chinese Olympic Committee, asked for the interview, and I think to their surprise they were granted one. It was inside the closed-loop system here, which separates everybody connected to the Games with the wider population in Beijing, and it was at a hotel which is the headquarters during the Olympics for the Chinese Olympic Committee. And Peng Shuai arrived, and it took place in the presence of a senior official, the Chief of Staff, Wang Kan, of the Olympic Committee, in a hotel room. But before they arrived in the negotiations before it, they had to, L'Equipe this is, they had to submit their questions beforehand, and they were asked not to make any comment, just to show the interview as it was played out. They weren't allowed to make any comment about that, and they didn't. They basically spelt out how the interview was organised and how it went.
Yeah, it is really important, isn't it, to understand the circumstances within which this interview did take place, because some have said or concluded that because of those, that this is nothing more than a propaganda exercise. Just explain that.
Yes, and that's been the stance from critics of China, of the way this whole situation has been handled, that Peng Shuai's not been allowed to talk freely, that she's been censored right from the start. As soon as she made those allegations in a post on social media where she alleged that the former vice premier in the Communist Party, a senior official, Zhang Gaoli, had sexually assaulted her. Now, during this interview, she again, as she did in December, when she spoke to a Singapore network, she denied that had happened, and she said that it had been her that had removed the post immediately, that post on November the 2nd. Now, she was asked about her life since November the 2nd, and she said it had been very normal. She said that she wasn't really aware of all the global concern. She thanked everybody who had been worried about her well-being, but she said it wasn't a problem, that she was a normal person and everything was normal. I don't think everyone will be satisfied with what's been said here, because, as you said, Maz, people are worried that she has been not allowed to speak, that all of this has happened under the watchful eye of the Chinese authorities, and they are controlling all of this. The WTA, the Women's Tennis Association, has been particularly critical of the Chinese authorities. They suspended all tournaments in China, but Peng Shuai said she had tried to reach out to the WTA, to Steve Simon. She sent emails to him to say that she was okay, but this interview is out there now. It's happened. It was the interview that everybody was trying to get, but I don't think it's going to allay those concerns you've been talking about.
Yeah, still plenty of questions. That was a BBC Sports reporter, Alex Capsick, speaking to Maz Faruqi there, Ali.
And Jared, in cricket, England have announced some coaching changes.
Yeah, they have. It's funny that you have to do that straight after a 4-0 Ashes Test series loss. Obviously, the England Cricket Board has decided enough is enough. They've appointed Paul Collingwood as their interim head coach for a 3-match Test series against the West Indies in March. He was previously in charge of the T20 side after that Ashes series. That was a 3-2 defeat in the Caribbean just last month, but now he's got that head coach role of the Test team as well. It was Chris Silverwood who was the coach during the Ashes. He left his role as head coach just last week following their Ashes defeat. Silverwood was joined by their director of cricket, Ashley Giles, and the assistant coach, Graham Thorpe, who have all stepped down following a run that seen England win just one of their past 14 tests. So a full sweep of the coaching department for England. Joe Root will remain as the Test captain, with Ben Stokes the vice captain. But interesting, only in the last few days, Ali, we've seen a number of former Australian Test cricketers encouraging Justin Langer, who of course resigned from the Australian head coach role, to coach England now. So the role's available. This new appointment's only an interim role. So what a story that would be if Justin Langer left the Aussies, went and coached England and came and took on the Australians in an Ashes series. Well, the next one will be in England. That would be some battle and some build-up.
Certainly would. I don't know if it's one I'd like to see.
No, it doesn't, and there's no suggestion he's going to do it either, but just some encouragement from his former teammates.
Jared Coop, thank you. Let's take a look at finance now as Wall Street comes to a close. The numbers are still settling, but it's been a bit of a mixed session. The Dow Jones is up by 12 points at the moment to 35,101. The S&P 500 is lower, down by 8 points to 4,492. The Nasdaq also lower, down by 44 points or 0.3% to 14,053. And checking the currencies, one Australian dollar is buying 71.2 US cents, 52 British pence, 62 euro cents, 82 Japanese yen and $1.07 New Zealand. A look at the forecast for the capital cities. In Brisbane, mostly sunny and a top of 30 predicted today. Currently it's 20 degrees. Sydney, a shower or two clearing with 25 the maximum, 16 at the moment. Canberra, a possible shower heading for a high of 24, right now sitting on 13. Melbourne, sunny and a high of 31, it's 17 at the moment. Hobart becoming cloudy with 23 the maximum forecast, currently sitting on 16 degrees. Adelaide afternoon showers will warm 34 degrees headed your way, currently sitting on 26. Perth mostly sunny and a maximum of 26 degrees. It's 13 at the moment. And in Darwin, showers and a possible storm and a high of 31. Currently it's 27 degrees. It's 8 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, 7:30 in South Australia, 7 o'clock in Queensland, 6:30 in the NT and 5 o'clock in the West.
Helen Zaremus with ABC News. Independent federal MP Zali Steggall says today marks an important first step towards reforming the culture inside Parliament House. The Commonwealth Parliament will offer a statement acknowledging past harassment, bullying and sexual assault that's happened there. An acknowledgement was the first recommendation of the Jenkins Review, launched after former staffer Brittany Higgins went public with her allegation she was raped. Ms Steggall hopes the statement sets a new era of better practices at Parliament.
Today's a first step, and I hope that they can feel heard and listened to, and that really that need to continually work on improving this workplace is on course and happening. It's a very important day.
A union representing aged care workers says it's wary of a plan to deploy Defence Forces into Australia's nursing homes. After weeks of resisting calling in the Defence Force, the federal government will make up to 1,700 personnel available to help with COVID outbreaks and staff shortages at aged care homes. But Carolyn Smith from the United Workers Union says exhausted staff have been disappointed by promises of help over the past few months.
They were promised a vaccination program, they were promised PPE from the national stockpile, they were promised a surge workforce, they were promised a booster program, and none of these things have rolled out well. So I think aged care workers are going to have a bit of it's welcome, but I will wait and see if this is yet another broken promise.
The first shipment of the Novavax COVID vaccine has arrived in Australia overnight ahead of a rollout later this month. Alison Shaw reports.
3 million doses of the Novavax COVID vaccine landed in Sydney from Singapore last night. The vaccine will be supplied to GPs, pharmacies and state hubs across the country and will be available from February the 21st. Australia has purchased 51 million doses of the Novavax vaccine, which is the fourth COVID vaccine available in Australia. It's approved for people aged 18 and over, but at this stage does not have approval to be used as a booster.
Western Australia's COVID rules and isolation protocols have been eased dramatically overnight. The details from James Carmody.
Anyone in WA who tests positive for COVID-19 will now only need to self-isolate for 7 days, after which time they can finish isolating without being tested if they have no symptoms. Anyone deemed a close contact of a case will isolate for 7 days too. And there are new close contact definitions. Someone will now only be a close contact if they are a household or intimate contact of a COVID positive person and have had contact with them during their infectious period, or if they had a close personal interaction with an infectious person while masks were removed, including more than 15 minutes spent face-to-face or 2 hours in a small room or classroom.
The New South Wales oppositions again accused the state government of pork barrelling. Labor says 75% of club grants were awarded to projects in New South Wales government-held seats. The grants for community, sport or health infrastructure are from club gaming machine profits. Australians installed a record number of solar on their rooftops last year despite disruptions caused by the pandemic. Daniel Mercer reports.
The Clean Energy Regulator says the amount of solar added to Australian rooftops hit a record last year. More than 360,000 systems were installed across the country, with a combined capacity of 3 gigawatts. The Grattan Institute's Tony Wood says solar is now a major source of generation, and reforms are needed to ensure the system can cope.
We've got to get on top of this. If we don't, there could be some nasty outcomes. That's not what we need, because that would set back the whole transition to low emissions, I think, very badly.
Mr Wood says solar capacity could double in coming decades.
To sport, Aussie cricketer Alyssa Healy says her team's demonstrated resilience as it prepares for the final Women's Ashes One Day today. The home side's already secured the series, but England presented a major obstacle and almost stole the Test match last week. Healy says the players are looking ahead to the World Cup in New Zealand next month.
The fact that we're able to fight scrap and work our way back into fixtures or win games, with our backs against the wall has been really impressive, and I think leading into a really big World Cup is hugely important.
And Aussie tennis player Alex de Minaur won his first round match in Rotterdam 6-love 6-3 over Belgian world number 47 David Goffin. He'll now meet 49th ranked American Mackenzie McDonald in round 2. This is ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
Good morning, I'm Ali Crew. Thanks for your company on this Tuesday, the 8th of February. Coming up,
we would expect a reasonably gradual uptake of international tourism into Australia. So I think the main first thing that airlines will be looking for is the detail and clarity around of the arrangements.
Australia prepares to welcome back vaccinated international travellers later this month after a 2-year ban. And federal parliament returns as ministers gear up for an explosive sitting week with religious freedom laws topping the agenda. Australia will open its border to all international visitors later this month, as long as they're double vaccinated. The ban on international arrivals will lift on February 21 after 2 years. Tourism chiefs are warning that it's not just like turning on a tap and that it could take the industry years to recover. About 1 million tourists arrived in Australia every month before the pandemic. That dropped dramatically in April 2020, down to around 6,500. So just how will the tourism industry recover? Graham Turner is the CEO of Flight Centre and he joins us now. Good morning, Graham.
Good morning, Alan.
Thanks so much for your time. Look, some experts are saying it could take 5 years for Australia to get back to the pre-pandemic volume of international visitors. Do you think that it could be that long?
Look, I think that's a bit pessimistic. I'm pretty confident that it's really about the tourist facilities and other things that specifically cater for international tourists. And I think it'll come back much quicker than that. But it's still going to take a year or two, probably. And you've still got the situation where a lot of Asia, which we do rely on a fair bit, is still pretty much closed. China and quite a few other Asian countries. So, and obviously New Zealand's another major player in this too that may not really be open properly until October, even if you listen to what the Prime Minister says. So, but other than that, I think it'll be a lumpy recovery. I think, but I think by mid-year here we will start getting significant numbers of tourists, but probably a couple of years to get back to those million or so visitors and China opening up and that sort of thing.
What about our image to overseas travellers? Even Tourism Australia says that the country has a bit of an image problem overseas and we've been ridiculed for the hard border. Do you think we're going to have problems luring people back here? And what do you think we need to do to regain the confidence of international travellers again?
Yeah, look, there will be an element of that. The main thing is that the governments keep to their word in terms of keeping the borders open. And there'll be challenges in that. We will have other waves of COVID almost for sure. There'll be other variants in that. The real thing that people are looking for is certainty that the borders, once they're open, they stay open, as long as you're vaccinated, for example. And I think that's the main thing. And people will get confidence. It won't take people long to be confident that they can believe what our governments are saying, that the borders are open, they're going to stay open. So I think that's a major thing. And then it's a slow, but, I think it'll be initially quite quick, but then it'll be a slow recovery to get back to, pre-COVID levels. But I think everyone in the tourism and travel industries will be okay with that, as long as we have that certainty. And airlines are the same. They're not going to put on capacity if they think the government's going to change their mind, even if it's in a few months' time. So that certainty is really important.
Let's turn to the cruise industry now, Graham. It says it's disappointed that it wasn't included in this announcement and cruises still can't restart operations here in Australia. What are your predictions about the cruising sector and how much longer it can survive without cruising out of Australian ports?
Yeah, well, I know already, some of the major cruise lines are redeploying their ships to overseas because obviously Europe's totally open. the States is totally open in cruising, and the protocols the cruise lines have for COVID-19 are the best in the world. They're the highest standards you can get. So I don't know what the Australian government and the state governments have against cruising. I guess it's the early COVID history of that. I know people who are involved in those protocols, and they are the highest standards of any sort of operation in the world. So I'm not sure what else they can do, but I think this will change once people get used to travelling. For example, you hop on a plane to London from Australia, and there's no testing requirements whatsoever. Pre-departure or post-departure is just no travel if you're sick. And I think once that sort of happens, this will change. That this attitude to cruising is, it's hard to understand, but I guess it's that early history.
You spoke about the certainty needed with borders staying open. What about uncertainty around vaccinations? At the moment, the international border is open to fully vaccinated come February 21, the international border will reopen to fully vaccinated travellers. Right now, they won't need the booster, but ATAGI is actually considering whether to change the definition of being fully vaccinated to include the booster. Do you think uncertainty around vaccinations and changing looks at this could hamper the recovery?
Yeah, it could. I mean, look, I think as time goes on, the vaccination, which is very important at the moment, and I think smart people are getting boosted as well. But still, you can catch the COVID, you can transmit it even if you're fully vaccinated with a booster. So I think in the end, pragmatism will happen, and the vaccination status will eventually disappear. But I think, from what I can see, for the next 6 months, fully vaccinated is going to be important for international travel at least, and ideally a booster. I'll be surprised if they make it a condition of entry to have that third vaccine, but it's possible in the next 6 months, although I think in 12 months' time, as long as the health system's coping well, that the vaccination status will be of secondary importance.
What do you think the industry needs most right now? Is it a big spending, marketing investment from government or a celebrity advertising campaign? What do you think's necessary?
Look, all we want, and I'm talking on the travel industry at the moment, and I think tourism is the same, is firstly certainty that they're not going to reverse their decisions, and secondly a gradual but clearly lessening of government restrictions, whatever they might be, whether it's testing, even the vaccination status and other things, so we can get back to what is probably the new normal, accepting that COVID is something we've got to live with. It's going to be around for some years, almost for certain, and we're going to have future variants, hopefully very mild like the Omicron. But I think as an industry we can survive and prosper as long as we have that certainty, and as long as in the longer run government restrictions are eased to get back to that new normal as soon as we can.
Graham, great to get your reaction today and hear your thoughts. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Ali. It's a pleasure.
Graham Turner, the CEO of Flight Centre, speaking to us there. Federal Parliament resumes today with the government's handling of the Omicron wave, the overburdened aged care sector and those text messages likely to be debating points. Protests outside the building are also likely, and inside, battles over the contentious religious discrimination bill are also expected. It was a major 2019 election commitment, yet the government's running out of time to honour it, and some coalition MPs say they're bewildered it's been put on the parliamentary agenda. Here's political reporter Stephanie Dalzell.
Texts, lies and video link. Federal Parliament's back for 2022. But if the Prime Minister's hoping it can fix a few political problems, that might be wishful thinking.
We need your voice.
Former Olympic swimmer Ian Thorpe is fronting an Equality Australia campaign against the government's religious discrimination bill. The proposed legislation's due to be introduced to Parliament this week, but with just 5 Senate sitting days scheduled before a likely May election, the government will need to ram it through quickly. As Liberal MP Katie Allen explains, different sections of the coalition want very different things from from the same piece of legislation.
Where it lands is still anyone's guess at this point in time because there are a lot of competing and conflicting interests.
The proposed laws are meant to prevent a person from being discriminated against on the basis of their religion. But Liberal moderates fear it goes too far and could protect people making discriminatory statements on other grounds. In a bid to get their backing, Scott Morrison's promised to ban schools from expelling students on the basis of their sexuality. That's a non-negotiable for Katie Allen.
There's no doubt that there are very strong emotions on both sides. And trying to navigate and getting the balance right is a very difficult thing to do.
Other Liberals want to shield teachers from being sacked for the same reason. But for Nationals MP Anne Webster, that's a step too far.
This bill is about protecting those who have religious belief and religious faith. And for people who hold religion seriously, and it's part of their life and part of who they are, part of their identity, then they need to be able to have a freedom around expressing that.
Tasmanian Liberal Erica Betts just wants the legislation passed.
The bottom line is that religious freedom does need to be protected, and in relation to schooling, ultimately it should be up to mums and dads to determine the basic ethos of the school.
The split in the Coalition party room is reflected in the religious community. The Catholic Bishops' Conference broadly supports the bill in its current form, but some from other faith groups like Sai Paravastu from the Hindu Council of Australia are concerned it will leave them more vulnerable.
For example, Hindus working in a faith-based school or hospital could be denied employment or can be fired.
With very few parliamentary weeks before the election, the Prime Minister's character continues to be put under question by his own side. The Nationals met yesterday with Barnaby Joyce offering what's been described as a brief and underwhelming explanation for those texts, labelling Scott Morrison a liar and a hypocrite. Anne Webster insists her party just wants to get on with the job.
I think that it's really interesting, the timing of texts that have been released, literally just before the election when they actually occurred 12 months or 2 years ago. It's difficult not to see that it's been orchestrated to cause the most disruption.
Disruption that has the potential to flare at any time, just as the parliamentary year begins.
Political reporter Stephanie Dalzell. You're listening to ABC News Radio. I'm Ali Crew. Also making news, Queenslanders will no longer have to check into supermarkets, gyms and retail stores, but they will still be required to scan the barcode at pubs, clubs and restaurants where mandatory vaccination rules apply. And the first shipment of the Novavax COVID vaccine has arrived in Sydney overnight, with about 3 million doses on board the flight from Singapore. They'll be available from GPs, pharmacies and state hubs across the country from the 21st of February.